My parents threw a lavish champagne-soaked party the exact same weekend I had to bury my husband and my 4-year-old daughter. When I stood freezing outside the county morgue, completely shattered, and begged my own father for help, he told me I was ruining my brother's vibe and told me to reschedule the funeral. They thought I was just a broke, grieving widow they could easily brush aside. They had no idea I was sitting on a $10 million fortune, and I secretly owned the very luxury estate where they were popping bottles and celebrating. I am Nia, 35 years old, and my entire universe was violently erased on a rainy Thursday night in late November. I was standing under the unforgiving fluorescent lights of the county hospital morgue staring at two cold steel tables. The scent of harsh bleach and sterile alcohol burned my nose, a smell that will haunt me for the rest of my life. My husband Jamal, my rock and my best friend, and our beautiful 4-year-old daughter Zuri. My absolute brightest light had just been taken from me. A drunk driver had run a red light going 70 miles an hour, striking their car on the way home from her evening ballet practice. In the span of a single horrifying phone call from the police, I went from a wife happily preparing dinner in our warm kitchen to a widow identifying the broken bodies of the two people I loved most in this world. My hands shook so violently I could barely hold the plastic clipboard the grief counselor gently handed me. My clothes were completely damp from the freezing rain outside, sticking to my skin like sheets of ice, but the cold I felt radiating inside my chest was far worse. It was a suffocating hollow numbness that threatened to pull me under. After signing the release paperwork with a pen that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, I could not bear to breathe the recycled hospital air for another second. I stumbled blindly out the automatic sliding glass doors and into the freezing, relentless downpour. The heavy rain hit my face, mixing instantly with the hot tears that I did not even realize I was shedding. The world around me was spinning dark, terrifying, and unbearably empty. In that exact moment of absolute devastation, stripped of my husband, my child, and my entire future, my first instinct was the same as any daughter's would be. I desperately needed my father. I needed my parents to be my anchor. I pulled out my cell phone, the screen slick with rain, and dialed my father, Calvin. I squeezed my eyes tightly shut, picturing him dropping whatever he was doing, rushing to his car, and telling my mother, Brenda, that they needed to get to the hospital immediately. I imagined him wrapping his strong arms around me, telling me that somehow, even though it was completely impossible, he was going to help me survive this waking nightmare. I just needed him to be a dad. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. I held my breath. Finally, the call connected. But I did not hear a concerned greeting or a rushed hello. Instead, a wall of deafening sound assaulted my ear. Heavy bass thumped through the speaker, accompanied by the loud clinking of crystal glasses, raucous cheers, and the unmistakable roar of a massive, expensive party. My heart skipped a beat, profound confusion momentarily piercing through my paralyzing grief. "Hello," my father answered, his voice dripping with intense annoyance and sharp impatience. "Speak up. I can barely hear anything in here." "Dad." I choked out my voice, cracking barely more than a desperate, ragged whisper. "Dad, there was a terrible accident. It is Jamal and Zuri. They are gone, Dad. They did not make it. I am at the county hospital right now. Please, you have to come here. The funeral has to be this Saturday. I do not know what to do. I need you." For a painful second, there was dead silence on his end, save for the thumping bass of a popular hip-hop track echoing in the background. I waited for the sharp gasp, the devastating shock, the immediate shift in his tone. I waited for the unconditional love I had spent 35 years begging for. "Nia, are you hearing yourself right now?" Calvin said coldly, his voice completely devoid of any warmth, shock, or empathy. "Saturday is DeAndre's 30th birthday gala. We have had this planned for 6 months. It is your brother's party, we cannot come. Have the funeral on Monday." Before I could even attempt to process the sheer unimaginable cruelty of his words, I heard my mother Brenda shouting in the background, her voice shrill and wildly festive. "Tell her not to ruin her brother's mood today. Keisha spent an absolute fortune on this venue. We are not leaving for anything. The line went dead. A sharp mechanical beep echoed in my ear, signaling that my father had hung up on me. He had hung up on his grieving daughter who had just lost her entire family, all so he could get right back to my brother's extravagant birthday party. I lowered the phone slowly. The freezing rain continued to soak through my clothes, but I no longer felt the cold weather. The suffocating sorrow that had gripped my throat just moments ago began to rapidly harden into something else entirely. Something incredibly sharp, terrifyingly precise, and completely devoid of tears. I looked down at the crumpled hospital paperwork in my hand, and then at the glowing screen of my phone, which still displayed my father's contact photo. They chose a birthday cake over my daughter's casket. They chose my brother's fragile ego over my literal survival. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had your heart completely shattered by the people who were supposed to protect you. And if you believe that sometimes toxic family members need to learn their lessons the absolute hard way. Growing up in a wealthy, prominent suburb of Atlanta meant maintaining a flawless, polished image to the outside world at all times. To our neighbors and our massive church congregation, my parents were the ultimate picture of African American excellence and success. But inside the walls of our sprawling colonial home, emotional starvation was the daily reality for me. My older brother DeAndre was the undisputed golden child, heavily praised and rewarded for simply breathing, while I was the designated scapegoat. I paid my own way through a state college by working 2 exhausting jobs, while my parents happily bailed DeAndre out of every failed, poorly planned business venture he ever launched. When I met Jamal 12 years ago, my family looked down on him because he was just a quiet, hardworking man building a small tech startup in the corner of our tiny, cramped apartment. They openly mocked his big ambitions at dinner tables. Even after Jamal and I married, my parents continued to treat me like a severe disappointment, actively ignoring our beautiful daughter Zuri, while showering DeAndre's spoiled kids with lavish, expensive gifts. But as I stood completely alone in the pouring rain outside the morgue, staring at the darkened sky, a new, powerful reality crystallized in my mind. My toxic family still thought Jamal was just a struggling, failed programmer, and that I was just a tired community center manager living paycheck to paycheck. They fully believed I was weak and powerless. They had absolutely no idea that Jamal's tech startup had recently been acquired by a major global conglomerate, or that he and I had quietly built a massive, highly successful real estate holding firm called Zuri Holdings. More importantly, they had no earthly idea that the extravagant, ultra-luxury estate DeAndre and his wife Keisha had proudly rented for his precious birthday gala tonight was owned by one of my corporate shell companies. They were dancing on my floors, they were drinking under my crystal chandeliers, and they had just confidently sealed their own financial destruction. I wiped the cold rain from my face, turned my back on the hospital doors, and walked purposefully toward my car. The helpless grieving widow died in that hospital parking lot, and the ruthless CEO of their impending ruin was born. Saturday arrived with a bitter, biting wind that swept through the cemetery. I stood over 2 freshly dug graves wearing a simple black dress, feeling entirely hollowed out. There was no grand procession. There was no overwhelming show of support from the family that had demanded perfection from me my entire life. Across from me stood Jamal's parents, their faces carved with an unimaginable grief that mirrored my own. Next to me stood Malik, my fiercely loyal corporate attorney and one of Jamal's oldest friends. He held an umbrella over my head, his jaw clenched tight as the minister spoke the final prayers. My biological family was completely absent. Not a single text message asking if I was okay, not a single floral arrangement. As the polished wooden caskets were slowly lowered into the earth, taking my entire heart down with them. My phone vibrated in my coat pocket. It was a sharp, persistent buzzing. Numbly, I pulled it out, half expecting a delayed apology from my father. Instead, my screen was flooded with social media notifications. DeAndre had just tagged the entire family in a series of live videos. I stared at the screen, watching my brother pop a massive bottle of expensive champagne, the liquid spraying over a cheering crowd at the exact luxury estate my company owned. Keisha was dancing in a custom designer gown, laughing loudly into the camera, and there, pinned at the very top of the comments section, was a message from my mother. "My perfect son deserves the world," she wrote, followed by a string of celebratory emojis. They were toasting to his life at the exact moment I was throwing dirt onto my daughter's grave. Malik glanced down at my phone screen. He did not say a single word of pity. He just adjusted his glasses and whispered, "Just say the word Nia, and I will burn their entire world to the ground." I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. "Not yet," I replied softly, my voice devoid of any emotion. "Let them enjoy the champagne. The bill is coming." 2 days later, I was sitting on the floor of my modest older townhouse surrounded by moving boxes. I had barely slept. Every corner of the house smelled like Jamal's cologne or echoed with the phantom sound of Zura's laughter. The doorbell rang sharply, breaking the suffocating silence. I pulled open the front door to find DeAndre and Keisha standing on my porch. They were not wearing black. They were not carrying food or offering a shoulder to cry on. Keisha was holding a massive iced coffee, wearing expensive designer sunglasses, and looking profoundly annoyed. "Wow, this place is depressing," Keisha announced, as she pushed past me without waiting for an invitation. She looked around my small living room, stepping over a box of Zura's toys with a look of utter disgust. That gala took everything out of me. I have been stressed for 48 hours straight, trying to manage the caterers and the cleanup crew. I stood by the open door, staring at the two of them. DeAndre collapsed onto my sofa, sighing heavily, as if he carried the weight of the world. "Look, Nia, I am sorry about Jamal and the kid," he said, casually waving his hand as if brushing away a minor inconvenience. "But we have a serious situation here. The gala went way over budget. Keisha insisted on the imported orchids and the premium open bar, and the vendors are threatening to sue my business if I do not pay them by Friday." I closed the front door slowly. "You came to my house 2 days after I buried my family to complain about flower arrangements," I asked, my voice dangerously calm. DeAndre rolled his eyes, clearly frustrated by my lack of immediate compliance. "Do not make this about you, Nia. I am in a bind. I know Jamal had that little startup job, so he must have had some kind of basic life insurance policy through his employer. I need a loan of $50,000 to clear these vendors. You do not need the money anyway. Jamal is gone, and you do not have a kid to feed anymore. Just wire me the cash and I will pay you back when my lifestyle brand takes off next quarter." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his words hung in the air. He was asking me to fund his vanity project with what he assumed was my dead husband's life insurance, using the tragic death of my 4-year-old daughter as a justification for why I no longer needed the money. I looked at the brother who had been spoon-fed his entire life. The golden child who had failed 3 separate businesses, all bailed out by my parents secretly remortgaging their house. The brother who could not be bothered to attend his own niece's funeral because it conflicted with his party schedule. "No," I said simply. DeAndre's face instantly contorted with rage. "Excuse me," he snapped, standing up aggressively. Keisha scoffed, crossing her arms defensively. "I said no, DeAndre. I am not giving you a single dime. Get out of my house right now." DeAndre grabbed his half-empty iced coffee from the table and hurled it violently across the room. The plastic cup shattered against the wall, splashing dark liquid over a framed photograph of Jamal and Zuri. "You selfish, ungrateful little brat," he screamed, his face red with fury. "Mom and Dad were right about you. You always have to play the victim. You have always been jealous of me, because they love me more. If you do not wire me that money by tonight, I am calling Dad. I will have them cut you out of this family entirely. You will be completely alone." I looked at the coffee dripping down the glass frame of my family picture. A terrifyingly cold smile slowly spread across my face. I am already alone. DeAndre? I said, my voice dropping to a chilling whisper. But you are right about one thing. Mom and Dad are going to have a lot to say about this. Now get out before I call the police. He stormed out, kicking a box of toys on his way with Keisha trailing behind him, muttering about how crazy I was. The second the door slammed shut, I did not cry. I calmly wiped the coffee off the photograph, then picked up my phone and dialed Malik. The line clicked open immediately. Malik, I said, my voice steady and completely emotionless. It is time. I want a full aggressive audit of DeAndre's luxury lifestyle brand. Find out every single creditor he owes. Find out who holds the paper on his debts. I want Zuri Holdings to buy all of it, every last cent. Understood. Malik replied smoothly, the sound of his fingers already typing rapidly on a keyboard. And what about your parents? Buy the mortgage on their house too, I ordered. They secretly used it to co-sign DeAndre's last failed venture. I want to own the roof over their heads, and I want to own the ground they walk on. Do it quietly, so they do not see it coming. Consider it done, boss, he said. I hung up the phone. My toxic family had spent 35 years treating me like I was completely worthless, demanding my obedience while starving me of affection. They thought cutting me off was their ultimate punishment. They did not realize that I was the one holding the scissors, and I was about to sever their entire financial existence. The financial chess game had officially begun, and I was going to strip away every single luxury they held dear until they had nothing left but the reality of what they had done to me. It took exactly 14 days for Malik to systematically and quietly purchase every single promissory note, outstanding line of credit, and mortgage agreement attached to my family. Zuri Holdings was now the sole owner of my parents' home and my brother's crumbling business empire. They were completely oblivious, still living their lavish lives, funded by money that now rightfully belonged to me. A week later, I received a cold text from my mother, Brenda, demanding my presence at a high-end steakhouse downtown. I knew exactly what this was: a coordinated ambush. I arrived wearing a simple, unassuming beige sweater and dark jeans, playing the part of the struggling, grieving widow to perfection. The hostess led me to a private dining booth where my father Calvin, my mother Brenda, DeAndre, and Keisha were already seated. They were dressed in designer clothes, sipping expensive red wine and laughing loudly. When I sat down, the laughter immediately stopped. My father Calvin did not even ask how I was doing. He just crossed his arms and glared at me. Brenda leaned forward, her face twisted in a mask of fake concern that quickly morphed into pure disgust. Nia, Brenda said loudly, making sure the waiter who was pouring water could hear her. We are extremely disappointed in your behavior. Family helps family. DeAndre is going through a very stressful time with his business, and you are being incredibly selfish by hoarding that life insurance money. I looked at the perfectly seared ribeye steak the waiter placed in front of my brother. You want me to give him $50,000 so he can pay for orchids and open bars at a party he threw on the day of my daughter's funeral? I asked softly. Calvin slammed his hand down on the heavy mahogany table, rattling the silverware. Stop living in the past, Nia, he snapped. It was a tragedy, yes, but Jamal would have wanted you to support your brother. You should sell your little townhouse, move into a cheaper apartment, and invest the equity into elite prestige. It is the Christian thing to do. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. The absolute delusion was staggering. They were sitting there completely bankrupt in reality, demanding I sell my home to fund a brother who had never worked a hard day in his life. I set my glass down and looked directly at my brother. Are you absolutely sure elite prestige is a safe investment right now, DeAndre? I asked, keeping my voice completely neutral. Because I heard a rumor in the financial district that your primary lender just sold all your commercial debt to a ruthless private equity firm. Zuri Holdings, I believe it was called. DeAndre burst out laughing, a loud, obnoxious sound that drew stares from the adjacent tables. Keisha joined in, shaking her head. Nia, please, DeAndre sneered. cutting a massive piece of his steak. You manage a community center. What do you know about high-level corporate finance or private equity? My lenders are practically begging to extend my credit lines. I am a VIP client. Do not try to use big words you do not understand, just to avoid helping your own blood. Calvin sighed heavily, rubbing his temples, as if my very presence was giving him a migraine. This is exactly why we rarely invite you out, Nia. You always try to sound smarter than you are, and it just ruins the entire mood. If you are not going to be a supportive sister, you can at least make yourself useful and pay the dinner tab since you ruined our appetite. He confidently slid the leather billfolder across the table toward me. The total was over $800, a feast of imported steaks, oysters, and vintage wine that I had barely touched. Normally, the old Nia would have cried. She would have felt the crushing weight of their rejection and panicked about how an $800 dinner would impact her grocery budget for the month. But the new Nia just smiled. I am happy to pay for my family, I said smoothly. I reached into my purse and pulled out a solid metal black Centurion card. I casually placed my thumb strategically over the exclusive logo and handed it to the waiter who was standing nearby. DeAndre rolled his eyes, not noticing the weight or the color of the card. Look at her putting it on a high-interest credit card she probably cannot even afford, he muttered to Keisha. The waiter returned a minute later, looking at me with a sudden profound respect. He handed the card back to me with a slight bow. Thank you so much, Mom. Have a wonderful evening. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my simple sweater. I looked down at the four of them, sitting in their rented designer clothes, digesting a meal I just bought them, living in houses I now secretly owned. Enjoy the rest of your night, I said quietly. I turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving them to their toxic delusions. They thought I was a clueless broke widow who would eventually crack under their pressure. They did not realize they had just handed the executioner a sharpened axe. The trap was set, the doors were locked, and they had absolutely no idea the building was already burning down around them. 3 months passed in absolute silence. I went completely no contact with my family. I blocked their phone numbers, ignored their occasional manipulative emails, and focused entirely on grieving my husband and daughter in peace. I spent my days walking through the quiet rooms of my home, holding Zura's favorite stuffed animal and managing my massive portfolio from my home office. I channeled every ounce of my sorrow into cold, calculated business precision. When the 90-day grace period on DeAndre's defaulted loans officially expired, I did not hesitate. I did not send a warning. I simply opened my laptop, pulled up his file on the Zuri Holdings secure portal, and clicked the button to initiate immediate aggressive foreclosure on everything he owned. Saturday morning broke with a heavy, suffocating gray sky that seemed to press down directly onto my chest. I stood inside the vestibule of a small, quiet community chapel, staring blankly at the polished wooden doors that led into the main sanctuary. Behind those doors rested 2 caskets. One was a standard size, holding the man who had patiently helped me build a beautiful life out of the wreckage of my childhood. The other was agonizingly small, holding the 4-year-old little girl who had been the absolute center of my universe. The harsh reality of what was happening threatened to buckle my knees with every step I took down the center aisle. The chapel was devastatingly empty. The echoing silence in the room was a brutal reminder of the isolation my family had forced upon me. There was no grand procession of supportive relatives. There were no comforting embraces from uncles or aunts who had watched me grow up. My entire biological family, the people who shared my blood and my last name, were miles away preparing for a birthday party. The wooden pews were mostly bare, save for the few people who genuinely understood the magnitude of what the world had lost. In the very front row sat Jamal's parents. They held on to each other tightly, their faces carved with a profound, quiet dignity that barely masked their shattering grief. Jamal's mother reached out and squeezed my hand as I took my seat next to her. Her grip was trembling but fierce, silently communicating a shared agony that required no words. I looked at her tear-stained face and felt a fresh wave of nausea wash over me. She had lost her only son and her only grandchild, yet she was still trying to comfort me. Meanwhile, my own mother could not be bothered to pause her party preparations to send a single text message asking if I was still breathing. Standing like a silent sentinel a few paces behind our row was Malik. Malik was not just my razor-sharp corporate attorney. He was Jamal's former college roommate, his closest confidant, and the brilliant legal mind who had helped us discreetly build Zuri Holdings from a modest real estate venture into a multi-million-dollar empire. Malik wore a perfectly tailored dark suit, but his usually composed face was tight with barely contained fury. He knew the truth about my wealth, and more importantly, he knew exactly why my side of the aisle was completely deserted. He had offered to drive to my parents' house and drag my father to the chapel himself, but I had told him no. I refused to beg people to mourn my family. The minister delivered a beautiful eulogy speaking about Jamal's brilliant mind and Zuri's infectious laughter. I sat completely frozen, staring straight ahead, trapping my tears behind a wall of absolute numbness. I knew that if I let myself break down in that chapel, I might never be able to put the pieces back together. I had to survive this. I had to stay strong enough to protect their memories. An hour later, we made the slow, painful drive to the cemetery. The freezing wind whipped across the open grounds, biting through my thin black wool coat. We gathered around the open earth, watching the cemetery workers gently prepare the caskets for lowering. The finality of the moment was entirely overwhelming. This was the exact second where I had to say my last goodbye to the two people who made my life worth living. I closed my eyes and took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to memorize the feeling of Jamal's arms around me and the sound of Zuri's voice calling for me in the morning. Right as the minister bowed his head to begin the final graveside prayer, a sharp mechanical vibration interrupted the sacred silence. My phone began buzzing relentlessly in my coat pocket. It was not a single polite notification. It was a rapid-fire, continuous shaking that demanded immediate attention. For a brief, foolish second, a tiny spark of naive hope flickered in my chest. Maybe it was my father. Maybe Calvin had realized the catastrophic mistake he was making. Maybe the guilt had finally consumed him, and he was calling to say he was on his way, begging for my forgiveness. My freezing fingers fumbled into my pocket, and I pulled out the phone. I looked down at the bright screen, and that tiny spark of hope was instantly extinguished, replaced by a dark, consuming ice. It was not a phone call. It was not a text message offering condolences. It was a flood of social media notifications. DeAndre and Keisha were broadcasting their lives to the world, and their followers were interacting with the posts in real time. Because my account was still linked to my brother's professional network, my phone was aggressively pushing the updates to my home screen. Unable to look away, I tapped the notification. An Instagram reel immediately began playing on silent. The screen filled with bright flashing party lights and the opulent interior of the massive luxury estate that my company secretly owned. DeAndre was standing on a velvet chair in the center of the room, wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo, holding a massive bottle of vintage Dom Perignon champagne. The crowd around him was cheering wildly as he shook the bottle and sprayed the expensive liquid all over the marble floors. The floors that I paid to maintain. The camera panned around the room, capturing the lavish ice sculptures, the towering floral arrangements, and the fully stocked premium open bars. Keisha stepped into the frame, wearing a sequined designer gown, throwing her head back in loud laughter as she danced with a group of friends. They looked completely carefree, utterly oblivious to the fact that they were standing inside a financial trap I had built, celebrating on the exact day my world ended. But what truly broke the final tether of my patience was the comments section below the video. Pinned proudly at the very top of the feed, highlighted for everyone to see, was a comment from my mother, Brenda. "My perfect son deserves the world. Best night ever. We love you, DeAndre." I stood in the freezing wind, standing 2 feet away from the freshly dug graves of my husband and my 4-year-old baby girl, reading my mother's enthusiastic praise for a brother who had never accomplished a single meaningful thing in his entire life. I stared at the timestamp on the video. It had been posted exactly 5 minutes ago. Right as the minister was asking God to grant my family eternal peace, my mother was typing out heart emojis on a party video. I swiped out of the application and opened my text messages. I scrolled past the messages from Jamal's coworkers, past the notes from my neighbors, and past the updates from Malik. I looked specifically for a message from Calvin Brenda or DeAndre. I checked the archived folders, I checked my voicemails. Nothing. Not a single word. Not a simple text asking if I was okay. Not a brief message asking how the service went. Complete and utter silence from the people who brought me into this world. They had completely erased me from their minds the moment the champagne started flowing. Malik stepped up quietly beside me and held his large black umbrella over my head, shielding my phone screen from the falling rain. He glanced down, catching a glimpse of the flashing party lights on the frozen video frame before the screen went dark. He did not offer any empty platitudes. He did not tell me that they were just grieving in their own way, or that family was complicated. He simply looked at the graves, then looked at me. Just say the word. Naya, Malik whispered, his voice dangerously low and steady, over the sound of the wind. Tell me what you want to do, and I will burn their entire world to the ground before Monday morning. I slowly locked my phone screen, plunging the device into darkness. I looked down at the caskets resting quietly in the earth. The profound, agonizing sadness that had been drowning me for the past 48 hours began to rapidly crystallize. The tears completely dried up, leaving behind a vision so sharp and clear, it felt like looking through cut glass. I was done being the scapegoat. I was done crying for a family that would gladly step over my broken body to get to a buffet line. Not yet, Malik, I replied softly, my voice devoid of any warmth or hesitation. Let them enjoy the champagne. Let them post their videos and pretend they are royalty. I want them to feel completely invincible. Because when the bill finally comes due, I'm going to make sure they lose absolutely everything. 2 days after the funeral, the silence in my townhouse was absolutely deafening. I sat on the living room floor surrounded by the beautiful, agonizing remnants of my shattered life. I was folding Zura's tiny ballet clothes, carefully placing them into a cardboard box. Every single breath I took felt like swallowing broken glass. I had not eaten a real meal in almost a week, surviving only on black coffee and sheer raw adrenaline. I was wearing one of Jamal's old college sweatshirts, drowning in the scent of his cologne that was slowly fading from the fabric. I was completely isolated in my grief, trying to figure out how a person is supposed to keep their heart beating when their entire reason for living has been buried in the cold earth. The sudden sharp ringing of the doorbell shattered the heavy quiet. It was not a gentle knock. It was an impatient, rapid-fire pressing of the button that echoed aggressively through my small hallway. I slowly stood up, my joints aching from the tension, and walked toward the front door. I looked through the peephole, fully expecting to see a delivery driver or maybe a concerned neighbor checking in on me. Instead, staring back at me through the distorted glass, were my brother DeAndre and his wife Keisha. I opened the door, a wave of confusion washing over me. They were not dressed in black. They were not carrying a casserole dish or a bouquet of sympathy flowers. DeAndre was wearing a pristine white designer tracksuit and limited edition sneakers, checking his gold watch with a look of extreme irritation. Keisha stood next to him in a matching athleisure outfit, her hair perfectly blown out, holding a massive iced caramel macchiato. They looked like they were on their way to a luxury brunch, completely untouched by the devastating tragedy that had just ripped our family apart. "Wow, it is incredibly dark in here," Keisha announced, pushing past me without waiting for an invitation or offering a single word of condolence. She marched into my living room, her expensive sneakers stepping carelessly close to the box of Zura's folded clothes. She dramatically pulled off her oversized sunglasses and sighed heavily, collapsing onto my sofa as if she had just completed a grueling marathon. I stood frozen by this open front door, staring at the brother who had skipped my daughter's funeral to spray champagne on a dance floor. DeAndre walked in after his wife, not bothering to wipe his shoes on the mat. He glanced around my modest older townhouse with a familiar expression of profound distaste. He had always hated my home, constantly criticizing the dated kitchen cabinets and the small square footage, entirely oblivious to the fact that Jamal and I loved this house because it was the first thing we had ever bought together. DeAndre, I said, my voice barely above a raspy whisper. What are you doing here? Keisha immediately groaned from the couch, rubbing her temples in a display of exaggerated exhaustion. Oh my God, Nia, you have no idea the 48 hours we have just had, she complained loudly. That birthday gala took absolutely everything out of me. The event coordinators were a complete nightmare to deal with. The caterers tried to overcharge us for the imported orchids, and I spent the entire morning arguing with the cleanup crew because someone stained the marble floors in the grand foyer. I am so stressed, I feel like I am going to have a panic attack. My feet are still swollen from those heels. I stared at her. I literally stared at this woman who was sitting in my living room complaining about her swollen feet and imported flowers exactly 48 hours after I watched the earth swallow my husband and my baby girl. The sheer, unadulterated narcissism was so staggering, it actually took my breath away. DeAndre waved his hand dismissively at his wife and turned to me, his expression hardening into a look of serious business. Look, Nia, we are all sorry about Jamal and the kid, he said casually, tossing the words out like he was apologizing for stepping on my toe. It is a tragedy, it really is. But we have a very serious, very immediate situation on our hands, and I do not have time to beat around the bush. I slowly closed the front door, leaning my back against the cool wood. What kind of situation, I asked, the numbness in my chest beginning to recede, replaced by a dark, creeping heat. The gala went way over budget, DeAndre stated, pacing across my living room rug. Mom and Dad covered the deposit, but Keisha insisted on upgrading to the premium open bar and the exotic floral arrangements at the last minute. Now the vendors are breathing down my neck. They are threatening to file a lawsuit against my luxury lifestyle brand if I do not clear the remaining balance by Friday. It would be a public relations disaster. It would completely ruin my reputation in the city. I am not sure how your party budget involves me, DeAndre, I replied, my voice dangerously flat. He stopped pacing and looked at me like I was the most oblivious person in the world. It involves you because I need a loan, he demanded, stepping closer to me. I know Jamal was just a mid-level guy at that little tech startup, but standard corporate packages always include some kind of basic life insurance policy. Even if it is just a fraction of his salary, you must be getting a payout soon. I need $50,000 wired to my business account by Thursday afternoon. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. I looked at his expectant face, trying to process the absolute depravity of his request. He had come to my house while I was literally boxing up my dead child's clothing to demand my husband's life insurance money to pay for his birthday party. I do not have $50,000 to give you, I said quietly. DeAndre rolled his eyes, a sharp scoff escaping his lips. Oh, stop playing the struggling victim, Nia. You do not need the money anyway. Jamal is gone. You do not have a kid to feed anymore. It is just you now. What are you going to do with that cash? Let it sit in a bank while your own brother's business goes under. Family helps family. Just wire me the funds and I will pay you back when my brand secures its next round of venture capital. Jamal is gone. You do not have a kid to feed anymore. Those words echoed in my mind, bouncing against my skull like physical blows. He had weaponized the death of my 4-year-old daughter to justify his greed. He saw my devastating loss simply as a reduction in my monthly living expenses. He saw my tragedy as his ultimate financial opportunity. A profound, terrifying calmness suddenly washed over me. It was the absolute absence of fear, the total eradication of any lingering sibling loyalty. I looked at the brother who had been spoon-fed his entire life. The golden child who had failed 3 separate businesses, all quietly bailed out by my parents. The man who stood in my home demanding the price of my family's blood to pay for his liquor bill. No, I said. DeAndre blinked, clearly taken aback by the immediate rejection. Excuse me. He snapped, his posture instantly becoming aggressive. Keisha stopped rubbing her temples and sat up straight, crossing her arms defensively over her chest. I said no. DeAndre? I repeated, my voice steady, completely devoid of any emotion. I am not giving you a single dime. I am not paying for your party. I am not saving your fake business. Now I want both of you to get out of my house immediately. DeAndre's face rapidly contorted with pure, unhinged rage. He grabbed his half-empty iced coffee from the side table and hurled it violently across the room. The heavy plastic cup slammed against the wall right next to my head, shattering on impact. Dark, sticky liquid exploded everywhere, splashing across the drywall and dripping directly onto a framed photograph of Jamal and Zuri laughing at the park. You selfish, ungrateful little brat, DeAndre screamed, his face turning an angry, mottled red. His veins bulged in his neck as he stepped aggressively into my personal space. Mom and Dad were always right about you. You always have to play the tragic victim. You are so utterly obsessed with yourself that you cannot even help your own flesh and blood. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I just looked at the coffee dripping down the glass frame of my family picture. You have always been so damn jealous of me, he continued to rage, spit flying from his lips. Just because Mom and Dad actually believed in my vision and funded my startups while you had to struggle and scrub toilets at the state college does not mean you get to punish me now. My businesses are complex. They take capital. You just push papers at a community center. You know absolutely nothing about the real world or building a legacy. I am trying to elevate this family name, and you are just a bitter, jealous scapegoat who wants to drag everyone down to your pathetic level. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. If you do not wire me that money by tonight, I am calling Dad. He threatened, his voice echoing loudly in the small room. I will tell them exactly how you treated me today. I will have Calvin and Brenda cut you out of this family entirely. You will not be invited to Thanksgiving. You will not be invited to Christmas. You will be completely alone for the rest of your miserable life. Let us see how you handle your precious grief when you have absolutely no family left to lean on. He stood there, chest heaving, waiting for me to break. He was waiting for the familiar tears. He was waiting for the lifelong conditioning of my childhood to kick in, the part of me that was terrified of parental rejection, the part of me that always folded under pressure just to keep the peace. But the scapegoat he remembered no longer existed. I looked at his red, angry face. I looked at Keisha, who was glaring at me with supreme entitlement. And then slowly I smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was a terrifying, dead-eyed curve of my lips that made DeAndre subconsciously take a half step back. I am already alone. DeAndre, I whispered, my voice dropping to a chilling, razor-sharp pitch. I have been alone my entire life. But you are absolutely right about one thing. Mom and Dad are going to have a lot to say about this. Now get out of my house before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing and vandalism. DeAndre stared at me, genuinely unnerved by the total lack of fear in my eyes. He opened his mouth to shout another threat, but the absolute coldness radiating from me silenced him. He scoffed loudly, grabbed Keisha's arm, and stormed toward the front door. You are going to regret this, Nia, he spat out as he crossed the threshold. You just made the biggest mistake of your pathetic life. He slammed the heavy front door shut behind him, rattling the picture frames on the wall. I stood in the silence of my hallway for exactly 10 seconds. I did not cry. I did not shake. I walked over to the wall, took a paper towel, and gently wiped the coffee off the glass frame, covering Jamal's and Zuri's smiling faces. I set the picture down carefully on the shelf. Then I reached into my pocket, pulled out my cell phone, and dialed Malik's private number. The line clicked open on the first ring. Malik, I said, my voice steady, precise, and completely devoid of any hesitation. I am here, Nia. His deep, calm voice replied over the speaker. What do you need? It is time, I commanded, staring at the closed front door. I want a full, aggressive, absolutely ruthless forensic audit of DeAndre's luxury lifestyle brand, Elite Prestige. I want you to uncover every single hidden creditor, every outstanding invoice, and every high-interest loan he has ever taken out. I want to know exactly who holds the paper on his debts. Understood. Malik replied, the rapid clicking of his keyboard immediately audible in the background. We have the capital ready to deploy. How far are we taking this? All the way, I said coldly. I want Zuri Holdings to buy all of his debt. I do not care if we have to pay a premium to acquire the promissory notes from his current lenders. I want to own every single financial obligation attached to his name. And Malik, look into my parents' real estate portfolio while you are at it. See if they secretly remortgaged their colonial house to co-sign DeAndre's last failed venture. If they did, I want to buy their mortgage too. I want to own the roof over their heads, and I want to own the ground they walk on. Do it quietly. Use the shell companies. I do not want them to see it coming until the trap completely snaps shut. Consider it done. Boss Malik said, a hint of dark satisfaction in his tone. I will have the preliminary acquisition files on your desk by tomorrow morning. I hung up the phone. My toxic family had spent 35 years treating me like I was completely worthless, demanding my obedience while starving me of affection. They thought cutting me off was their ultimate punishment. They did not realize that I was the one holding the financial guillotine, and I was about to sever their entire existence. The opening move had been played, and I was going to strip away every single luxury they held dear until they had absolutely nothing left to hide behind. The very next morning, the sharp buzzing of my intercom broke the silence of my home office. It was Malik. He did not even bother with a greeting. He just told me he was standing on my front porch with the preliminary acquisition files, and I needed to see them immediately. I opened the door to find Malik holding a thick leather briefcase, his expression a mixture of deep professional satisfaction and sheer disbelief. I led him into my home office, a quiet room lined with bookshelves where Jamal and I had spent countless late nights building our real estate portfolio. Malik set his briefcase on my large oak desk, popped the brass locks, and began pulling out stacks of heavily tabbed legal folders. I had my forensic accounting team work through the night, Malik said, spreading the documents across the dark wood. You knew DeAndre was bad with money, Nia, but you had absolutely no idea how deep this hole really goes. Elite Prestige is not a luxury lifestyle brand. It is a spectacular towering house of cards, and it is currently standing in a hurricane. I pulled out my reading glasses and picked up the first folder. Walk me through it, I commanded, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted bank statements. Malik leaned forward, tapping a silver pen against a spreadsheet. DeAndre has zero liquid capital. Every single thing he flaunts on social media is aggressively leased or financed at incredibly predatory interest rates. The custom tuxedo he wore to the gala, leased. The 2 luxury sports cars sitting in his driveway, financed through a subprime auto lender, and he is currently 3 months behind on payments. He owes caterers, event planners, and private security firms over $200,000. His primary business line of credit is completely maxed out, and the bank is preparing to send his accounts to a third-party collection agency by the end of the month. I stared at the numbers, feeling a cold, hollow sense of vindication. My brother had stood in my living room and called me a pathetic paper pusher, while his entire extravagant existence was funded by missed payments and aggressive debt. But how did he secure a commercial line of credit this large with a history of failed businesses? I asked, tracing a finger down the massive principal balance of his primary loan. No reputable bank would underwrite this level of risk without substantial collateral. And DeAndre does not own any real assets. Malik stopped tapping his pen. He looked up at me, his eyes dead serious. That brings us to the second folder. The collateral. He slid a blue folder across the desk. I opened it and my breath hitched slightly in my throat. It was a copy of a commercial loan agreement, but the signatures at the bottom did not just belong to DeAndre. Staring back at me in stark black ink were the legally binding signatures of my father Calvin and my mother Brenda. I looked at Malik, waiting for the explanation I already knew was coming. Your parents secretly took out a massive second mortgage on their colonial house, Malik explained quietly. They leveraged every single ounce of equity they had built over the last 30 years to act as the primary guarantors for DeAndre's business loans. If Elite Prestige defaults, the bank has the legal right to seize your parents' home to satisfy the debt. They literally bet the roof over their heads on your brother's vanity project, and they are losing horribly. I sat back in my leather chair, staring at my parents' signatures. They had refused to help me pay for college because they claimed it would drain their retirement fund. They had complained about the cost of the modest floral arrangement I requested for my daughter's funeral. Yet they had secretly risked their entire financial foundation so DeAndre could spray vintage champagne on a rented marble floor. The sheer magnitude of their favoritism was no longer just an emotional wound. It was a documented, legally binding financial suicide. I closed the blue folder, placing my hands flat against the cool leather cover. Do they know how close they are to losing the house? I asked. Malik shook his head. DeAndre has been intercepting the warning letters and hiding the delinquency notices. Your parents think his business is thriving. They have absolutely no idea that the bank is drafting the foreclosure documents as we speak. A deep, profound silence settled over my office. I looked at the framed photograph of Jamal and Zuri sitting on my desk. Jamal had always told me that one day my family would face the consequences of their toxic behavior. He had spent years trying to show me my own worth, begging me to stop seeking validation from people who only saw me as a burden. He was not here to see this moment, but I was going to finish the work he started. I was going to finally sever the chains they had wrapped around my neck since childhood. Malik, I said, my voice cutting through the quiet room like a freshly sharpened blade. I want Zuri Holdings to initiate a quiet, aggressive buyout. Contact DeAndre's primary lenders and the bank holding my parents' second mortgage. Offer to purchase the entirety of their debt portfolios at a 20% premium above market value. Malik raised an eyebrow, a slow, predatory smile forming on his face. A 20% premium. They will trip over themselves to sell that toxic debt to us. They want these high-risk accounts off their ledgers immediately. Exactly, I replied smoothly. I do not want any lengthy negotiations. I want this done fast, and I want it done under the absolute protection of our corporate shell companies. Make sure the transfer of ownership is buried under layers of non-disclosure agreements. Calvin, Brenda, and DeAndre cannot know who bought their debt until I am ready to look them in the eyes and tell them myself. I will have the legal team draft the acquisition offers within the hour, Malik said quickly, gathering the folders and sliding them back into his briefcase. By the end of the week, Zuri Holdings will hold the physical deeds, the promissory notes, and every single legal right to their assets. You will literally own them, Nia. You will be their sole creditor. Make it happen, I ordered. Over the next 7 days, I watched from the shadows as Malik orchestrated the most ruthless, precise financial takeover of my entire career. The desperate lenders eagerly accepted our premium cash offers, offloading DeAndre's toxic accounts, and my parents' heavily leveraged mortgage directly into the iron grip of Zuri Holdings. The paperwork was signed, sealed, and securely locked inside my private company vault. I was no longer just the grieving widow or the discarded scapegoat daughter. I was the invisible architect of their impending ruin. They were sleeping in beds I owned, driving cars I controlled, and living a lie that I could shatter with a single phone call. The board was set, the pieces were locked into place, and I was patiently waiting for my mother to make the next move. I knew she could never resist an opportunity to show off, and I only had to wait a few more days before my phone lit up with her inevitable summons. The summons came on a Tuesday afternoon in the form of a brief, cold text message from my mother. It did not ask how I was coping with the deafening silence of my empty house. It did not ask if I was sleeping or eating. It simply dictated a time and a location. A high-end, incredibly exclusive steakhouse in the downtown financial district. It was exactly the kind of place my family frequented to project an image of generational wealth and elite status. A place where the waiters wore white gloves, the lighting was intentionally dim, and the appetizers cost more than my weekly grocery bill. I arrived exactly on time. I did not dress to impress them. I wore a simple black cashmere sweater, a pair of dark slacks, and completely flat shoes. I wore no jewelry, and my face still carried the pale, exhausted shadows of a woman who had just buried her entire world. The hostess, a young woman with a highly polished professional smile, guided me through the bustling dining room. We walked past tables of corporate executives and wealthy socialites moving toward the back of the restaurant until we reached a private, secluded corner booth draped in heavy velvet curtains. My family was already seated. They had not waited for me to arrive before ordering. The large mahogany table was completely covered in extravagant dishes. Towering seafood platters resting on crushed ice-thick cuts of prime beef, gourmet side dishes, and 3 open bottles of imported vintage red wine. DeAndre was wearing a custom-tailored velvet blazer, laughing loudly at something Keisha had just said. Keisha was dripping in heavy gold jewelry, her hair perfectly styled, holding a crystal wine glass with an air of absolute superiority. My father, Calvin, sat at the head of the table cutting his steak with the precise, arrogant movements of a man who firmly believed he owned the world. My mother, Brenda, sat next to him wearing a silk designer blouse that I knew for a fact cost more than my first car. Not a single one of them wore black. Not a single one of them looked like they were in mourning. They looked like they were celebrating a massive corporate victory. When I slipped into the empty leather chair at the end of the booth, the loud laughter immediately died down. DeAndre stopped smiling, glanced at my plain black sweater, and openly rolled his eyes as if my grief was a deliberate fashion mistake designed to embarrass him in public. Keisha took a slow sip of her wine and looked away, completely ignoring my presence. My father did not even bother to look up from his plate. He just continued chewing his food, letting the silence stretch out until it became thick and heavy with hostility. It was my mother who finally broke the quiet. She carefully wiped the corners of her mouth with a crisp linen napkin, folded her hands on the pristine white tablecloth, and fixed me with a stare so devoid of maternal warmth it could have frozen boiling water. "Well," Nia, Brenda said, her voice loud enough to carry to the adjacent tables despite the private setting. "We are extremely disappointed in your recent behavior. It is absolutely unacceptable." I looked at her, my hands resting quietly in my lap. I did not flinch. I did not immediately apologize or ask what I had done wrong like I used to when I was a terrified teenager. I just let her talk, knowing with absolute certainty that every single word she spoke was just another nail in her own financial coffin. "Your brother came to your house offering an olive branch." Brenda continued, her tone dripping with toxic self-righteousness. "He took time out of his incredibly busy schedule, right after hosting a massive, highly successful gala, to check on you. And instead of being grateful for his presence, you treated him with absolute disrespect. You refused to help him in his time of need. You screamed at him and threw him out of your house like a common criminal." I slowly shifted my gaze to DeAndre. He was leaning back in the plush leather booth, a smug, deeply satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He had clearly run straight back to Mommy and Daddy, twisting the narrative to paint himself as the benevolent, caring brother, and me as the hysterical, unhinged widow. He had conveniently left out the part where he demanded $50,000, insulted my dead daughter, and shattered a heavy plastic coffee cup against my living room wall. I did not scream. I replied, my voice perfectly level and unnervingly calm. I simply told him I was not giving him my money to pay for his party. Calvin suddenly slammed his heavy silver fork onto his porcelain plate. The sharp metallic clatter made Keisha jump slightly, but I did not blink. "Stop being so incredibly selfish, Nia," my father snapped, glaring at me fiercely from across the table. "We raised you better than this. Family helps family. That is the fundamental rule of this household. DeAndre is on the verge of taking elite prestige to the next level. He is building a legacy for our family name, and he is dealing with a minor temporary cash flow issue. You are sitting on a life insurance payout that you are just hoarding for absolutely no good reason. I stared at the man who was legally bound to a catastrophic second mortgage he could not afford, fiercely defending the son who had drained his retirement accounts dry. The profound delusion in his eyes was almost fascinating to witness. He was shouting at me about legacy and wealth, completely unaware that his own legacy was currently locked inside a filing cabinet in my home office. Keisha chimed in, swirling her expensive wine with a dramatic sigh. Honestly, Nia, it is completely embarrassing that we even have to ask you for this. We had to put the entire premium floral budget on my personal credit card because you were being so ridiculously stubborn. It is just extremely tacky to hold out on your own brother when you have no real expenses anymore. You do not have childcare costs. You do not have a husband to feed. I felt a dangerous icy heat begin to spread through my veins, but I kept my face entirely impassive. Brenda leaned forward, invading my personal space across the table, her voice dropping into a register of manipulative fake concern. It is not just about the money, Nia. It is about your current living situation. You are rattling around in that old townhouse all by yourself now. It is not healthy for a single woman to live in a house that large with so many sad memories. The property taxes and the upkeep alone must be draining your small accounts. You should sell your little townhouse, move into a practical one-bedroom apartment closer to the community center. You can take the equity from the sale and invest it directly into your brother's business. You will get a return on your investment eventually, and you will be properly supporting your own flesh and blood. I sat perfectly still. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her proposal hung in the air like a poisonous fog. She wanted me to sell the home where I had built a beautiful, loving life with Jamal. She wanted me to sell the house where my daughter took her very first steps and laughed in the backyard. She wanted me to render myself essentially homeless, stripping away my sanctuary just so DeAndre could pay off the caterers and bartenders from a party he threw on the exact day I buried my child. And then Brenda crossed the final unforgivable line. Besides, Brenda added, softly tilting her head with a sickening look of mock sympathy. It is exactly what Jamal would have wanted. He always knew DeAndre was meant for greater things. Jamal would have wanted you to use his money to help this family succeed. The ambient noise of the bustling steakhouse completely faded away. The clinking crystal glasses, the soft jazz music playing from the overhead speakers, the low hum of wealthy conversation all vanished into a ringing, absolute silence in my ears. A cold, devastating fury ignited deep inside my chest, burning with a terrifying clarity. She had invoked my dead husband's name. She had twisted Jamal's beautiful memory, a man who had actively despised their toxic entitlement and protected me from their abuse, to manipulate me into funding my brother's pathetic, failing vanity project. My heart beat slowly and steadily against my ribs. If they only knew. If they only knew that the quiet woman sitting in front of them, wearing plain clothes and an expression of calm endurance, was not a helpless grieving victim. If they only knew that I was the phantom CEO of Zuri Holdings, the very entity that now held the physical deeds to everything they claimed to own. They were aggressively demanding that I sell my small house, completely and utterly unaware that I was the exact person who could legally evict them from theirs by the end of the week. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I looked directly into my mother's eyes, letting the heavy, suffocating silence stretch until she finally shifted uncomfortably in her leather seat. I did not break eye contact with my mother. I let her sit in the deeply uncomfortable silence she had just created, watching as the smug confidence slowly began to drain from her face. I reached across the pristine white tablecloth and picked up my crystal water glass. The condensation was freezing against my skin, grounding me, keeping the absolute inferno of my rage tightly contained. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The ice clinked softly against the rim. "Are you absolutely sure Elite Prestige is a safe investment right now, Dad?" I asked. My voice was completely neutral, devoid of the emotional breakdown they were so desperately trying to provoke. Calvin stopped chewing his prime rib. He looked at me with a mixture of confusion and profound irritation. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. I set my glass down precisely on the coaster. "I am just asking a basic financial question," I said smoothly, "because I heard a very interesting rumor in the financial district this week. Word is that DeAndre's primary commercial lender just sold the entirety of his business debt to a ruthless private equity firm. A complete portfolio offload. Usually a bank only does that when an account is considered highly toxic and completely unrecoverable. So before I sell my home and liquidate my assets to fund his company, I just want to make sure my brother is not secretly drowning in high-interest defaults." For a split second, a flash of genuine panic crossed DeAndre's eyes. It was incredibly fast, a microscopic twitch of his jaw, but I caught it. However, his lifelong conditioning of absolute arrogance immediately kicked back in. He threw his head back and let out a loud, condescending laugh that echoed across the private dining alcove. "Oh my God!" Nia DeAndre scoffed, wiping a fake tear of mirth from his eye. He looked at Keisha, who was already giggling behind her manicured hand. "Are you seriously sitting here trying to talk high-level corporate finance with me right now? This is rich. This is absolutely hilarious." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, looking at me like I was a particularly slow toddler. "Let me explain something to you, little sister, since your experience at the community center clearly has not prepared you for the real business world. My lenders are not selling my debt because I am toxic. They are restructuring my accounts because I am a premium high net worth client. It is called debt consolidation and portfolio optimization. You would not understand the mechanics of it. Private equity firms buy premium paper all the time to capitalize on high-yield returns from successful lifestyle brands. It is literally a sign of massive growth and industry trust. The sheer confidence with which he delivered that absolute garbage was breathtaking. He was using corporate buzzwords he clearly did not understand to mask the fact that he was financially bleeding to death. He actually believed his own lies. He had no idea that the private equity firm he was currently praising was owned entirely by the woman sitting directly across from him. Keisha chimed in, swirling her vintage wine with a smirk. "Honestly, Nia, it is embarrassing that you are trying to sound smart right now. You read one article on a finance blog and suddenly you think you are an investment banker. DeAndre just hosted the social event of the season. We had state senators at our gala. Do you really think a bank would drop us? You are just trying to find a pathetic excuse to keep Jamal's money all to yourself." I looked at Keisha, noting the heavy designer necklace she was wearing, knowing for a fact that it was purchased on a credit card that was currently 30 days past due. I did not bother correcting her. I did not tell her that the state senators she was bragging about had drank my champagne on my property. I just offered a faint, chilling smile. "I am just looking out for the family legacy," I replied softly. "After all, if DeAndre defaults, whoever co-signed those massive commercial loans would be legally responsible. And that would be catastrophic for their retirement, would it not?" My father slammed his hand down on the heavy mahogany table. The silverware rattled violently against the porcelain plates. "Enough," Calvin barked, his voice dripping with intense authoritarian anger. "I am sick and tired of this absolute nonsense. We bring you to a nice restaurant, we try to include you in family matters, and you sit here trying to act like you are the smartest person in the room. You have always done this, Nia. You always try to undermine your brother because you are fundamentally jealous of his success." He pointed a thick finger at me across the table. "DeAndre's business is thriving. My financial planning is flawless. The only thing toxic at this table right now is your bitter, ungrateful attitude. You have officially ruined the mood of this entire evening. I cannot even digest my food looking at your sour face." Calvin signaled aggressively for the waiter. A young man in a crisp white shirt hurried over, looking slightly alarmed by my father's hostile posture. "Bring the check," Calvin demanded loudly. "We are leaving." The waiter nodded quickly and retreated. Calvin turned his furious glare back to me. His chest was heaving with indignation. He was a man who demanded total submission, and my simple, calm questions had threatened his fragile illusion of control. He could not stand the fact that the daughter he viewed as completely worthless was questioning his golden child. "Since you are so incredibly concerned with our family finances," Calvin sneered, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive tailored shirt, "you can make yourself useful for once in your life. You are going to pay for this dinner. Consider it a small penalty for your profound disrespect tonight. And until you are ready to apologize to your brother and write that check to help his business, do not bother calling us." Brenda nodded in fierce agreement, grabbing her designer clutch from the table. "We are trying to help you, Nia," she said, her voice dripping with fake disappointment. "But you refuse to let go of your petty jealousy. Paying for dinner is the absolute least you can do after ruining our night." I sat perfectly still in the leather booth. I looked at the 3 half-empty bottles of vintage wine, the crushed ice melting under the expensive seafood towers, the remains of the prime rib that I was now being forced to purchase. They were punishing me. They thought handing me an outrageously expensive dinner bill was a devastating financial blow that would put me in my place. They wanted me to feel the sting of poverty, to remind me that I was just the scapegoat who existed only to serve their needs and absorb their expenses. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully asserted their dominance. I did not argue. I did not shed a single tear, nor did I beg my father to reconsider his harsh demand. I simply looked at the leather bill folder resting on the table, and then I looked back at the 4 people who were staring at me with expressions of triumphant malice. They genuinely believed they had just delivered a crushing blow. In their minds, forcing me to pay an $800 dinner tab was the ultimate reality check. It was a punishment meticulously designed to remind me of my place at the absolute bottom of the family hierarchy. The old Nia would have completely panicked. The old Nia would have stared at that receipt and calculated exactly how many extra shifts she needed to pick up just to keep the lights on. But the old Nia was buried in the cemetery next to her husband and daughter. I raised my hand and calmly waved down our waiter. He hurried over immediately, his eyes darting nervously between my father's red, angry face and my completely serene expression. I reached into my small black purse and bypassed the standard everyday debit cards I kept in the front pocket for appearances. Instead, my fingers found the heavy cold metal of my black Centurion card. It was an exclusive invitation-only credit card reserved solely for individuals with exceptionally high net worth. It was the kind of card that did not have a preset spending limit. I pulled it out smoothly, making sure to place my thumb firmly over the distinct logo in the center. I did not want to give any of them the satisfaction of a premature reveal. I handed the heavy metal card to the waiter with a polite smile. DeAndre scoffed loudly, leaning back in his plush leather chair and crossing his arms. "Look at her," DeAndre muttered to Keisha, his voice intentionally loud enough for me to hear over the ambient noise of the restaurant. "Putting an $800 dinner on a high-interest credit card she probably cannot even afford. She will be paying off those steaks for the next 5 years." Keisha snickered, pulling a compact mirror from her purse to reapply her expensive lipstick. "Well, maybe next time she will learn to keep her mouth shut when the adults are talking about real business." The waiter returned a moment later, and his entire demeanor had drastically shifted. When he initially took the card, his customer service smile had been standard and professional. But now, holding the leather folder containing my receipt, he looked at me with a profound, almost reverent respect. People working in the high-end service industry knew exactly what the weight of a solid metal black card meant. He placed the folder gently in front of me and offered a deep, polite nod. "Thank you so much for your extraordinary generosity tonight, Mom," the waiter said, his voice carrying a tone of absolute deference. "It has been an absolute pleasure serving you." I had tipped him $500. I knew exactly what it was like to work hard for arrogant, ungrateful people, and my family had treated him terribly all evening. I took a sleek custom pen from my purse, signed the receipt with a fluid motion, and slipped the heavy card securely back into my bag. My father watched me, a smug smile of absolute satisfaction firmly planted on his face. He leaned back, taking a final victorious sip of his vintage wine, firmly believing he had successfully put his rebellious, jealous daughter back in her miserable place. I stood up from the booth and smoothed the front of my simple black sweater. I looked down at them one last time. They looked so incredibly proud of themselves sitting in their rented designer clothes, digesting a massive feast they had just forced me to purchase, living in homes and running businesses that I now legally owned. "Enjoy the rest of your evening," I said quietly. The tone of my voice was perfectly polite yet completely devoid of any familial warmth. I turned my back on them and walked out of the private dining alcove. I moved steadily through the bustling restaurant, the sound of their toxic laughter fading into the background. When I stepped through the heavy glass doors and out into the cool, crisp night air of the financial district, I took a deep breath. My heart was not racing. My hands were not shaking. I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of peace. They thought I was a clueless, broke widow who would eventually crack under their pressure. They thought they had successfully punished me. They did not realize they had just handed the executioner a sharpened axe. The trap was perfectly set, the heavy steel doors were securely locked, and they had absolutely no idea the building was already burning down around them. The next 90 days were a masterclass in absolute silence. I completely vanished from their world. I changed my personal cell phone number, upgraded the security system at my townhouse, and routed every single email address associated with my parents and my brother directly into a hidden spam folder. When I walked out of that high-end steakhouse, my father had loudly demanded that I not speak to them until I was ready to apologize and hand over my money. I simply granted his wish to the extreme. I used the profound quiet of those 3 months to properly grieve my family. Without the constant toxic demands of my mother or the manipulative text messages from my brother, I finally had the space to breathe. Winter crept into the city, blanketing the streets in freezing frost. I spent my days walking the quiet paths of the cemetery, sitting for hours by the matching marble headstones I had carefully designed for Jamal and Zuri. I allowed myself to completely break down. I cried until my vision blurred, and my throat ached, letting the agonizing waves of loss crash over me in the safety of my empty house. I packed away Zuri's tiny ballet shoes and Jamal's favorite winter coats, folding the memories into boxes, with a reverence that my biological family could never understand. I also spent a significant amount of time with Jamal's parents. I attended weekly Sunday dinners at their modest home. They did not ask me for money. They did not criticize my clothing or tell me I was ruining their mood. They just asked me to pass the roasted potatoes and held my hand tightly when the dinner table felt a little too quiet. We shared stories about Jamal. We laughed through our tears about Zuri's fierce toddler attitude, and we healed together. That is what a real family does. They show up when the house is dark, not just when the cameras are flashing. But while my heart was slowly learning how to beat around the massive permanent hole in my chest, my mind was operating with terrifying surgical precision. Twice a week, Malik would come to my home office. We would sit at my heavy oak desk drinking black coffee and monitoring DeAndre's financial accounts like hawks watching a severely wounded animal. Zuri Holdings now completely owned Elite Prestige and my parents' second mortgage. Every single dime my family owed was legally bound to my corporate entity. Exactly as Malik had predicted, DeAndre did not even notice that his massive commercial debt had been quietly sold to a new holding company. The notification letters were sent to his business address, but he was far too busy living a fake lifestyle to open boring bank envelopes. Through his public social media profiles, I watched him post pictures of himself and Keisha at exclusive ski resorts. I watched him lease a brand new luxury SUV to replace the one he had scratched the month before. He was spending money he absolutely did not have, completely ignoring the updated payment portals Malik had established. DeAndre missed his December payment. He did not even log into the system to check his balance. He missed his January payment. He was too busy hosting a New Year's Eve yacht party that he funded with high-interest payday loans. And when the middle of February rolled around, he missed his third consecutive payment. Standard commercial banks might have sent a polite warning letter. They might have called his business manager to offer a restructured payment plan or a temporary grace period. They would have extended professional courtesy to a man who presented himself as a wealthy socialite. Zuri Holdings did not offer courtesy. Zuri Holdings offered consequences. On a freezing Tuesday morning, exactly 90 days after that disastrous dinner at the steakhouse, I sat in my home office with Malik on speakerphone. The sky outside my window was gray and heavy with impending snow. My laptop screen displayed the live secure feed of DeAndre's commercial accounts. The legal grace period for his third missed payment officially expired at exactly 9 in the morning. I watched the digital clock in the corner of my screen change from 8:59 to 9 o'clock. "Do it," I said, my voice completely devoid of any warmth or hesitation. At 9:01, Malik executed the legal protocols. It was the digital equivalent of dropping a heavy iron guillotine. Zuri Holdings immediately initiated full aggressive foreclosure proceedings against Elite Prestige. Malik's legal team electronically filed the emergency injunctions with the city court, citing massive financial negligence, breach of contract, and consecutive default. We legally seized control of his business bank accounts, his commercial leases, and his operating licenses. But I did not stop there. The true beauty of this trap was the collateral. Because the commercial loan was directly tied to the second mortgage on my parents' massive colonial house, the default of Elite Prestige triggered an automatic catastrophic financial reaction. Calvin and Brenda were the primary legal guarantors. They had signed the dotted line pledging their entire net worth to back my brother's delusions of grandeur. The moment Malik filed the foreclosure on DeAndre, the banking algorithms automatically flagged my parents' profiles. It happened with breathtaking speed. In the span of a few hours, my father's premium corporate banking accounts were completely locked. My mother's shiny platinum credit cards were instantly suspended by the issuing banks due to the massive sudden liability appearing on her credit report. The massive home equity line of credit they had been using to secretly fund their lavish country club memberships and designer wardrobes was completely severed. The bank automatically seized their liquid savings to hold in escrow pending the foreclosure investigation. Every single safety net they had spent 30 years building was completely vaporized in the span of a single morning. I leaned back in my leather chair, watching the confirmation emails from the courts flood into my secure inbox. The screen cast a cool blue light across my face. I thought about my father telling me I was worthless. I thought about my mother demanding I sell my house. I thought about my brother throwing a cup of coffee at a picture of my dead daughter. They had gone to sleep on Monday night as wealthy, arrogant socialites who believed they were utterly untouchable. They woke up on Tuesday morning with less financial power than a college student holding a maxed-out debit card. The 90 days of silence were officially over. The storm they had been begging for had finally hit the shore, and they were standing outside without an umbrella. I did not have to be physically present to know exactly how the chaos unfolded that night. Malik had hired a highly discreet private investigator to monitor the asset seizure, ensuring every single legal protocol was strictly followed. The detailed report I received the next morning read like a perfectly scripted tragedy, a fitting end to decades of unchecked arrogance. It started at exactly 2 in the morning. A fleet of heavy-duty commercial tow trucks pulled up to the gated driveway of DeAndre and Keisha's rented luxury mansion. The amber flashing lights of the trucks pierced through the dark, illuminating the perfectly manicured lawns and the towering front columns. The repo men did not knock politely. They did not call ahead to schedule a convenient time. They immediately backed up their trucks and began hooking heavy steel chains to the imported sports car and the massive luxury SUV that DeAndre flaunted on his social media profiles every single day. The loud clanking of heavy metal chains woke Keisha. She ran out onto the driveway in her silk designer pajamas, screaming at the men at the top of her lungs, threatening to call the police and ruin their lives. DeAndre sprinted out right behind her, his face pale with absolute paralyzing panic. He tried to play the big shot. He puffed out his chest and marched up to the lead driver, demanding they unhook the vehicles immediately. He was arrogant enough to believe he could just buy his way out of a court-ordered repossession right there in the driveway. He pulled out his expensive leather wallet and grabbed his platinum business credit card, ordering the driver to run it for whatever the late balance was. The driver, completely unfazed by DeAndre's wealthy facade, pulled out a mobile payment terminal. He swiped the card. Declined. DeAndre snatched the card back, his hands shaking, claiming it was just a daily spending limit issue. He pulled out a second premium card. He swiped it. Declined. He pulled out a third card, his breathing turning into rapid, shallow gasps. Declined. His entire financial existence had been frozen by the court order I initiated. He watched in total crushing humiliation as the tow trucks shifted into gear and drove away into the night, taking his fake status symbols with them. Keisha was completely hysterical, grabbing his arm and demanding to know why the cards were not working. She screamed that she had a country club brunch the next morning and needed her car. DeAndre could not answer her. His phone was suddenly blowing up with automated text messages from his bank notifying him that his commercial accounts had been seized. Terrified and completely broke, DeAndre did the only thing he knew how to do when his life fell apart. He ran to his parents. Because he literally had no vehicles left to drive, he had to order a rideshare using an old prepaid debit card he found in his desk drawer. He left Keisha crying in the grand foyer and directed the driver to our parents' massive colonial house across town. He was sweating in the back seat, staring out the window, desperately telling himself that Calvin would fix it. Calvin always fixed it. Calvin would write a massive check, yell at the bank manager, and everything would go back to normal. But when his car pulled into our parents' circular driveway just before dawn, he did not find a sanctuary. He found the second wave of the storm. The heavy front porch light was glaring fiercely against the dark morning air. My father, Calvin, was standing on the brick front steps, wearing his silk bathrobe. He was not looking at the arriving car. He was not reading his morning paper. He was standing completely frozen, staring blankly at a thick, bright yellow legal document that had been securely taped to his heavy oak front door. DeAndre ran up the steps, his voice cracking as he shouted for his dad to help him. He started frantically explaining that the bank had made a huge mistake, that the cars were gone, and that his accounts were somehow locked. But Calvin did not even look at his golden child. His hands were shaking violently. He slowly peeled the heavy legal notice off the wood. It was the official notice of default and immediate foreclosure from Zuri Holdings. DeAndre stopped talking when he saw the sheer, unadulterated terror in his father's eyes. Calvin looked at his son, his face instantly aging 10 years in a single night. "We have nothing left," Calvin whispered, his voice completely hollow, devoid of the booming authority he usually carried. "The bank took it all." "You told me the business was thriving, DeAndre. You sat at my dinner table and told me the loan was completely secure." DeAndre stammered, trying to construct a lie on the spot. He claimed it was just a temporary restructuring issue with his new private equity lenders, promising he could clear it up by the afternoon. But the official court seal on the foreclosure notice was absolute. Calvin pushed past him and walked back into the house, leaving the front door wide open. Inside, the situation was even worse. Brenda was sitting at the massive granite kitchen island, her phone surrounded by a pile of cut-up credit cards. She was crying hysterically. She had woken up an hour earlier to a barrage of automated alerts from her premium wealth management banks. She had called the emergency 24-hour customer service line, ready to scream at a representative for the inconvenience. Instead, a polite operator informed her that every single account associated with her Social Security number was frozen. The massive home equity line of credit they had been using to secretly fund their lavish vacations and designer wardrobes was completely severed. The retirement savings they had pledged as collateral for DeAndre's business were locked in escrow, pending the foreclosure investigation. They could not transfer funds. They could not withdraw cash. They could not even buy a gallon of milk. Calvin dropped the yellow foreclosure notice onto the kitchen counter. He looked at his wife, who was sobbing into her hands, and then he looked at the son who had just bankrupted their entire bloodline. The wealthy facade they had meticulously maintained for over 30 years shattered completely before the sun even came up. The country club memberships, the tailored suits, the arrogant smirks they wore while looking down on people like me, it was all gone. They were drowning. For the first time in their incredibly privileged lives, there was no secret bank account to bail them out. There was no one left to manipulate. The water was rising fast, pulling them under, and they had absolutely no idea that the daughter they had discarded was the one controlling the tide. By noon on Tuesday, the sheer, unadulterated panic radiating from my parents' house was practically vibrating through the city limits. Malik was sitting across from me in my home office, casually drinking a cup of dark roast coffee while monitoring the incoming communications on his secure corporate laptop. We had built an absolute impenetrable firewall around the executive structure of Zuri Holdings. My name was buried under layers of ironclad non-disclosure agreements and anonymous corporate trusts. To the outside world, the company was a massive, faceless financial juggernaut managed entirely by a phantom chief executive officer. Calvin did exactly what entitled arrogant men do when they suddenly hit a solid brick wall. He tried to bully his way through it. He immediately called his expensive, high-powered corporate attorneys at one of the most prestigious law firms in the state. According to the updates, Malik's network was intercepting. My father was screaming into the phone, demanding that his lawyers file an emergency court injunction to stop the foreclosure process. He aggressively ordered them to find a legal loophole in the commercial loan agreements, absolutely convinced that his status and his wealth could somehow invalidate a legally binding contract. But there were no loopholes. Zuri Holdings had executed the debt acquisition with flawless surgical precision. Less than 2 hours later, Calvin's legal team was forced to deliver the crushing, undeniable reality to their furious client. The debt transfer was perfectly legal. The default clauses were exceptionally rigid and completely unforgiving. Because DeAndre had missed 3 consecutive commercial payments, the bank was well within its rights to seize the collateral. And because Calvin and Brenda had foolishly attached their primary residence and their retirement portfolios as the ultimate guarantors for that debt, they were completely at the mercy of the new creditor. Calvin's lawyers told him the hard truth. They could not fight this in a courtroom. They had zero leverage. Their only remaining option was to swallow their immense pride, reach out to the holding company, and quite literally beg for their financial lives. At exactly 1 in the afternoon, the dedicated secure phone line on Malik's desk began to ring. It was the lead partner from Calvin's legal team. Malik looked at me across the desk, a slow, highly satisfied smile spreading across his face. He pressed the speakerphone button, allowing the desperate, tense voice of my father's attorney to echo through my quiet home office. "This is Malik, lead counsel for Zuri Holdings," he answered, his voice dropping into a register of pure, intimidating corporate ice. "State your business." The lawyer on the other end cleared his throat nervously. "Yes, Malik, thank you for taking my call. I am representing Calvin and DeAndre regarding the recent accelerated foreclosure filings executed by your firm this morning. We believe there has been a significant misunderstanding regarding the payment schedules. My clients are prominent, highly respected members of the local business community. We are formally requesting an emergency 30-day grace period to restructure the liquid assets and satisfy the outstanding balance." I sat back in my leather chair listening to this highly paid professional grovel on behalf of the man who had told me I was completely worthless just 3 months ago. Calvin was too much of a coward to make the call himself. He was hiding behind his legal shield, desperately hoping that his fabricated reputation would save him from total ruin. Malik leaned back and let a heavy, suffocating silence stretch over the phone line for a full 30 seconds. He let the attorney sweat. "Zuri Holdings does not operate on misunderstandings," Malik finally replied, his tone sharp and utterly dismissive. "Your clients defaulted on 3 consecutive commercial cycles. They hid the delinquency notices. They actively engaged in gross financial negligence. We do not grant grace periods to high-risk liabilities. The asset seizure will proceed as filed. Please wait." The lawyer practically begged, his professional composure cracking under the pressure. Calvin is prepared to offer a substantial good faith payment by the end of the week. He just needs an audience with your chief executive officer. He firmly believes that if they can just sit down face to face as fellow business leaders, they can reach an amicable settlement that benefits everyone. He is asking for a single meeting. That is all. I looked at Malik and gave him a slow, deliberate nod. It was time to bait the final trap. Malik sighed loudly into the receiver, sounding profoundly inconvenienced by the request. Our chief executive officer is an incredibly busy woman, he stated clearly. She does not take meetings with defaulting debtors. She does not negotiate with individuals who fail to honor their basic financial commitments. I could hear the frantic whispering in the background on the other end of the line. Calvin was standing right next to his lawyer, aggressively pacing the floor, listening to his entire legacy hang by a fragile thread. However, Malik continued, his voice perfectly measured. Our CEO is scheduled to attend the annual Black Business Leaders Gala tomorrow evening at the downtown Grand Ballroom. She will be the keynote speaker. Because she respects the sanctity of that specific event, she has authorized me to grant your clients a very brief, highly conditional audience. Oh, thank God, the lawyer breathed out, the overwhelming relief palpable through the speaker. Thank you. What time should they be there? The CEO will meet them in the private VIP suite immediately following her keynote address, Malik instructed coldly. They will have exactly 5 minutes to state their case and present a viable restructuring plan. If she is not completely satisfied with their proposal, the foreclosure will be finalized on Thursday morning, and the eviction notices for their primary residence will be served by noon. Tell your clients not to be late. Malik ended the call without waiting for a response. The line went dead, plunging my office back into a quiet, heavy peace. I looked at the framed photograph of Jamal and Zuri resting on the corner of my desk. I gently traced my fingers over the glass. My family had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. They had systematically excluded me, mocked my ambitions, and treated my grief like an inconvenient burden. And now they were frantically scrambling in the dark, desperately begging for a 5-minute meeting with a phantom billionaire they believed was their only savior. They thought they had a real chance. I knew exactly how Calvin's mind worked. He believed that he could put on his best custom-tailored tuxedo, flash his charismatic, arrogant smile, and charm this mysterious female CEO into giving him his wealth back. He genuinely thought that because he was a man of supposed status, the rules of consequence simply did not apply to him. He thought he was walking into a high-level corporate negotiation. He had absolutely no idea he was walking straight into a public execution. The moment the lawyer relayed the message, the atmosphere inside my parents' house shifted from absolute despair to a frantic, delusional hope. Calvin immediately began pacing the living room, his previous terror replaced by the arrogant swagger I had despised my entire life. He told Brenda to wipe her tears, declaring that this was just a high-stakes negotiation. He firmly believed that the mysterious female CEO of Zuri Holdings was simply testing their resolve. He was convinced that if they showed up to the Black Business Leaders Gala looking like old money, he could charm her into a favorable restructuring deal. He told his family they just needed to play the part of the untouchable elite for one more night. But playing the part requires capital, and their capital was entirely locked inside the corporate vault of my shell company. When Brenda tried to book an emergency appointment at her exclusive salon, her platinum card was declined. When Calvin tried to hire a private black car service to drive them to the gala, the account was flagged for insufficient funds. They were completely paralyzed. The only lifeline they had left belonged to Keisha. She had a single high-interest emergency credit card hidden in her purse that was registered under her maiden name, which meant it had not yet been swept up in the automatic foreclosure algorithms. With a credit limit of barely $3,000, it was the absolute last drop of financial blood they possessed. Instead of using that money to buy groceries or secure a cheap hotel room in case the bank seized their house, my family did what they always did. They invested everything into their fake image. They spent the entire afternoon frantically driving across the city in Keisha's modest sedan, pooling the last of her credit to rent designer outfits from a high-end boutique. Brenda selected a heavy silk evening gown. Calvin rented a pristine, custom-tailored tuxedo. DeAndre and Keisha picked out matching luxury evening wear, completely ignoring the fact that their cars had been towed by repo men just hours before. They spent hours in the bathroom of the colonial house, aggressively styling their hair and applying expensive makeup, desperately trying to paint over the terrifying reality of their bankruptcy. I sat in my home office reviewing my keynote speech, receiving live updates from Malik about their frantic movements. I pictured my father standing in front of his full-length mirror, adjusting his silk tie and practicing his most charismatic, condescending smile. I pictured my brother spraying on his expensive cologne, truly believing he was about to talk his way out of a multi-million-dollar default. They spent 3 hours picking out their absolute best designer clothes, desperately trying to impress the ruthless billionaire who was actively ruining them. They thought they were getting dressed for the most important financial negotiation of their lives. They had absolutely no idea they were getting dressed for their own funeral. The downtown Grand Ballroom had been transformed into an absolute masterpiece of modern wealth and corporate elegance for the annual Black Business Leaders Gala. Towering crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the sea of perfectly set banquet tables. The room was filled with the city's most powerful and influential figures, from tech innovators and real estate tycoons to city council members and prominent investors. It was the exact type of high society environment my family worshipped. I was not on the main floor. I stood quietly in the darkened backstage control room, completely hidden behind the heavy velvet stage curtains. Malik stood to my right, leaning against a massive soundboard. In front of us was a large bank of high-definition security monitors, displaying live feeds of the entire ballroom. At exactly 7 o'clock, the main double doors swung open, and my family made their grand entrance. If you did not know the absolute truth, you would have thought royalty had just arrived. They walked into the room radiating a deeply manufactured, aggressive confidence. Calvin led the pack, wearing his rented custom tuxedo, his shoulders pulled back, surveying the room with the arrogant posture of a king inspecting his domain. Brenda glided right beside him in her heavy silk gown, carrying a designer clutch that contained absolutely 0 usable credit cards. DeAndre and Keisha trailed closely behind their faces, plastered with practiced photogenic smiles. They looked like the ultimate picture of generational success. But looking closely at the high-resolution monitors, I could clearly see the microscopic cracks in their desperate facade. Calvin's jaw was clenched so tight the muscle was jumping under his skin. Keisha kept nervously adjusting her rented necklace, her eyes darting around the room as if expecting a repo man to jump out from behind a floral arrangement. DeAndre was sweating slightly around his collar, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. They were terrified, but their immense pride refused to let them show it. Instead of keeping a low profile, they immediately hit the floor to network aggressively, overcompensating for the massive financial black hole they were currently falling into. I tapped the audio control board, isolating the microphone feed nearest to the VIP section where they had stationed themselves. Their voices instantly filled the quiet control room. Calvin wasted absolutely no time. He intercepted a prominent local real estate developer and a senior vice president of a regional bank. I listened in cold silence as my father began weaving an elaborate, sickening web of lies. "Oh, the business is absolutely booming," Calvin boomed loudly, slapping the bank executive on the shoulder. His voice dripped with fake, relaxed confidence. "We are actually in the middle of a massive strategic corporate restructuring right now. We are just optimizing the portfolio and liquidating some redundant assets. You know exactly how it is when you reach a certain tax bracket. The accounting gets highly complicated." The real estate developer frowned, slightly swirling his bourbon. "Really?" he asked. "Because I heard some rather concerning rumors buzzing around the financial district this morning regarding elite prestige. Something about a massive commercial default." Calvin threw his head back and let out a loud, entirely hollow laugh. He waved his hand dismissively as if the developer had just told a mildly amusing joke. That is just the inevitable noise of aggressive market expansion. Calvin lied seamlessly, not missing a single beat. People see a company shifting its capital, and they immediately assume the worst. In fact, the restructuring is going so incredibly well that we are taking a private meeting with the Chief Executive Officer of Zuri Holdings tonight, right here in the VIP suite after the keynote address. We are finalizing the details of a highly exclusive multi-million-dollar partnership. She personally requested the audience. I stared at the monitor, absolutely mesmerized by his profound delusion. He was standing in a rented tuxedo, his bank accounts completely frozen, actively lying to industry leaders about a partnership with the very company that was preparing to evict him from his home. DeAndre eagerly jumped into the conversation, desperate to validate his own shattered ego. He turned to a young investment broker standing nearby and completely fabricated a story about his vehicles. Yes, I actually just sent my entire luxury fleet back to the dealership last night. DeAndre bragged loudly, adjusting his rented velvet blazer. The leasing terms were simply not favorable anymore, and I am upgrading the executive fleet to the newest models next month. Sometimes you just have to clean house and start fresh, you know. Keisha nodded vigorously in agreement, holding her empty crystal champagne flute with her pinky finger fully extended, desperately trying to project an aura of old money. Their deep, suffocating financial terror was beginning to manifest as extreme hostility toward the working-class event staff. Because they felt entirely powerless in their reality, they decided to punch down to prove they still belonged in this room. I watched my mother Brenda snap her fingers aggressively at a passing waiter who was carrying a tray of appetizers. "Excuse me." Brenda snapped, her voice sharp and incredibly condescending. "These crab cakes are barely lukewarm. This is supposed to be a premium event, not a discount buffet. Take this tray back to the kitchen immediately and bring us something that is actually edible. And tell the bartender I need a fresh glass of Pinot Noir, but tell him to actually let it breathe this time." The young waiter apologized profusely and hurried away, his face flushed with embarrassment. A few minutes later, DeAndre aggressively berated a busboy for accidentally brushing against his chair, loudly threatening to have the venue manager fire him on the spot. They were completely broke. They were literally facing total bankruptcy and homelessness by Thursday morning. Yet, they were standing in the middle of a crowded ballroom, looking down their noses at people who actually earned an honest living. Their arrogance was not just a defense mechanism anymore. It was a terminal disease. Malik stood next to me, shaking his head in absolute disgust as he watched the monitor. "They really believe they are going to talk their way out of this," Malik muttered, his arms crossed over his chest. "They think they are going to walk into that VIP room tonight and charm you into handing their entire lives back to them." I did not say a word. I just watched them dig their graves deeper and deeper into the polished marble floor. Every single lie they told, every powerful person they bragged to, and every waiter they insulted was just rapidly increasing the height from which they were about to fall. They had spent their entire lives obsessing over public perception. They worshipped the opinions of the elite society gathered in this very room. They had built their entire identities on the foundation of looking better than everyone else. The tension in the grand ballroom was mounting to a fever pitch. The lights began to slowly dim, signaling the start of the formal evening program. The event announcer stepped up to the main podium and politely asked all the attendees to please take their assigned seats. Calvin confidently led his family toward the front of the room. They took their places at a premier center stage table reserved for the most prominent guests. They sat down, smoothing their rented clothes, completely unaware of the devastating, inescapable storm that was brewing just a few yards away behind the heavy velvet curtains. The ballroom settled into a hushed, expectant murmur as the event coordinators silently signaled the waitstaff. An army of servers in crisp black uniforms began weaving seamlessly through the VIP tables, distributing the evening's formal programs. Tucked inside each heavy velvet presentation folder was a complimentary copy of the city's premier financial quarterly magazine, a special edition printed exclusively for the gala attendees. I leaned closer to the security monitor in the backstage control room, my heart beating with a steady, icy rhythm. I watched as a young waiter gently placed a velvet folder directly in front of Keisha. Keisha was half listening to Brenda complain about the ambient lighting when she casually flipped open the folder. She picked up the glossy magazine with one hand, holding her freshly filled crystal champagne flute in the other. She intended to briefly scan the pages for pictures of people she knew, hunting for any scrap of society gossip to distract herself from her financial terror. Instead, her eyes landed dead center on the cover. I watched the exact millisecond her brain processed the image. Her entire body went completely rigid. Her jaw dropped slightly, all the color draining from her perfectly contoured face. The crystal champagne flute slipped straight through her trembling fingers. It hit the heavy edge of the marble table and shattered violently against the polished floor, sending expensive alcohol splashing across her rented designer heels. The sharp, explosive sound of breaking glass echoed loudly in their section of the ballroom. Several heads turned in their direction, annoyed by the sudden disruption. DeAndre immediately hissed at his wife, clearly embarrassed by the clumsy destruction of their fake, perfect image. He grabbed a cloth napkin and leaned over angrily, asking her what was wrong with her. But Keisha could not speak. She was completely paralyzed, staring down at the glossy paper in her lap as if it were a live explosive. Frustrated by her absolute silence, DeAndre reached over and aggressively snatched the magazine from her hands. I watched the blood rapidly drain from my brother's face, leaving behind a sickly, chalky gray pallor. Staring back at him from the cover of the prestigious financial publication was a high-fashion, full-page portrait of his little sister. I was wearing a razor-sharp, bespoke designer suit, looking directly into the camera lens with an expression of absolute, untouchable authority. Underneath my photograph, printed in bold, unmistakable silver lettering, was the headline that would effectively end his life as he knew it. From tragedy to triumph. How Nia built a $10 million empire in honor of her late husband and daughter. DeAndre stared at the cover, his mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish. His hands shook so violently he could barely turn the pages. He flipped frantically to the featured article on page 4. There, spread across two massive glossy pages, was the complete, undeniable truth of my existence. The article detailed the massive success of Jamal's tech startup acquisition. It praised the aggressive, brilliant expansion of my real estate holding firm. And most importantly, it named my company in bold black ink. Zuri Holdings. The phantom financial juggernaut that had just seized his business, towed his luxury cars, and frozen his entire existence. Calvin leaned across the table, his face flushing with sudden anger as he noticed DeAndre's terrifying panic. "Give me that," Calvin demanded in a harsh whisper, snatching the magazine out of his son's trembling hands. Brenda leaned over Calvin's shoulder, adjusting her reading glasses to see what had caused such a dramatic public reaction from her golden child. I watched the monitor closely as my father read the bold headline. I watched his eyes scan down the page to read the name of my company. Zuri Holdings. Named after the 4-year-old granddaughter he had refused to bury because he had a birthday party to attend. The psychological collapse was instantaneous and absolute. You could actually see the invisible shockwave hit the four of them at the exact same time. The arrogant swagger, the fake confidence, the desperate networking they had been doing all evening, it all evaporated into thin air. Calvin dropped the magazine onto the table as if the paper had physically burned his fingers. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. He looked at DeAndre, who was staring blankly at the shattered glass on the floor, breathing in rapid, shallow gasps. Brenda covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror as a muffled sob escaped her throat. In that singular, devastating moment, every single puzzle piece snapped violently into place for them. They suddenly understood why I did not cry when DeAndre threw the coffee cup at my wall. They understood why I so calmly paid the $800 dinner tab with a heavy metal credit card without flinching. They realized that the mysterious, ruthless billionaire chief executive officer they had spent 3 hours getting dressed up to beg for mercy was the exact same woman they had spent 35 years abusing and dismissing. They had not been dealing with a faceless corporate bank. They had been dealing with the scapegoat they created. The realization of their total destruction washed over them. Keisha realized she was married to a man who was literally owned by his sister. Brenda realized her massive colonial house, her country club memberships, and her designer wardrobe were entirely at the mercy of the daughter she had treated like garbage. And Calvin realized that his entire legacy, his precious wealth, and his towering pride had been completely dismantled by the woman he had called a clueless paper pusher. Malik let out a low, dark chuckle beside me in the control room. "Look at them," he whispered, gesturing to the high-definition monitor. "They look like they just saw a ghost." I kept my eyes locked on my father. He was gripping the edge of the marble table so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He looked physically sick. He was trapped. There was no running away from this. There were no expensive corporate lawyers who could save him now. He was sitting in a room full of the exact elite society he worshipped, surrounded by peers he had just lied to, and he was completely powerless. The main stage lights suddenly flared to life, casting a brilliant, blinding white glow across the massive ballroom. The low murmur of the crowd instantly died down as the event announcer walked up to the sleek acrylic podium. The formal program was officially beginning. I turned away from the security monitors and took a deep breath. I smoothed the lapels of my custom suit. My heart was completely steady. My mind was crystal clear. The long, agonizing months of careful planning, the sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, the silent tears I had shed at the cemetery, they had all led directly to this exact second. It was time to step out of the shadows. It was time to show my family exactly what happens when you mistake my silence for weakness. The event announcer leaned into the microphone, his deep, resonant voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the grand ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, honored guests, and distinguished leaders," he began, commanding the absolute attention of the massive room. "Tonight, we have the distinct privilege of hearing from a visionary who has single-handedly redefined the landscape of private equity and commercial real estate in our city." The ballroom fell incredibly silent. Even the waiters stopped moving, standing at attention along the velvet-draped walls. For the past 3 years, the announcer continued, his voice projecting a profound respect. "This individual has built an unstoppable financial empire from the ground up, entirely away from the public eye. She has mastered the art of aggressive acquisitions, corporate restructuring, and absolute financial accountability. But more importantly, she has proven that true legacy is not inherited. It is built through resilience, forged in the fires of unimaginable personal tragedy, and executed with flawless precision." Please join me in giving a massive warm welcome to our keynote speaker, the majority shareholder and chief executive officer of Zuri Holdings, Nia. The heavy velvet curtains parted seamlessly. The massive theatrical spotlights immediately snapped to the center of the stage, creating a brilliant, blinding path of pure white light. I stepped out from the shadows. I did not wear a rented evening gown. I wore a razor-sharp, custom-tailored midnight blue designer suit that fit me like a suit of armor. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, unforgiving style, and my posture was completely straight. I walked across the polished wooden stage with the slow, measured steps of a woman who completely owned every single inch of the room. The clicking of my stilettos echoed briefly before the entire ballroom erupted into a deafening roar of thunderous applause. Hundreds of the city's most powerful bankers, politicians, and developers stood up from their tables, offering me a standing ovation before I had even spoken a single word. I walked directly to the clear acrylic podium and placed my hands firmly on the edges. I looked out over the sea of applauding elite, the bright stage lights reflecting off the crystal chandeliers above them. And then I lowered my gaze directly to the premier center stage VIP table, located exactly 10 feet in front of my podium. The contrast was absolutely breathtaking. While the rest of the ballroom was standing and cheering wildly, my biological family was completely paralyzed. They were physically glued to their rented chairs, staring up at me as if they were looking at a terrifying apparition. My father Calvin had lost all the color in his face. His mouth hung slightly open, his hands gripping the white tablecloth so hard I could see his knuckles turning stark white. My mother Brenda was visibly shaking, a single tear cutting through her heavy, expensive makeup, her chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. Keisha was staring at the floor, completely unable to make eye contact with me, her hands folded tightly in her lap. And DeAndre, my golden child brother, looked completely destroyed. The arrogant smirk he had worn since childhood was permanently erased, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. He was looking at the sister he had called a clueless paper pusher, realizing that I was currently receiving a standing ovation from the exact billionaires he had spent his entire life desperately trying to impress. I waited patiently for the applause to die down. When the attendees finally took their seats and the room settled into a heavy, expectant silence, I leaned into the microphone. "Thank you," I said, my voice carrying clearly and powerfully across the massive space. "It is a profound honor to stand before you tonight." I let my eyes sweep across the crowd before locking my gaze dead center onto my father. 3 months ago, my entire world was violently erased. I began my tone completely steady, devoid of the tears my family was so accustomed to seeing. I lost my brilliant husband and my beautiful 4-year-old daughter in a horrific accident. In the span of a single evening, I was stripped of everything that gave my life meaning. And in the immediate aftermath of that devastating loss, I learned a very harsh, very cruel lesson about the nature of loyalty. The ballroom was absolutely silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpeted floor. I learned that the people you expect to support you the most are often the first ones to abandon you, I said, staring directly into my mother's terrified eyes. I learned that there are people in this world who care more about their social schedules, their expensive parties, and their fragile egos than they care about basic human decency. When I stood in the freezing rain outside the county hospital morgue and asked for help, I was told that my grief was simply an inconvenience. I was told to reschedule my daughter's funeral so it would not interfere with a birthday celebration. A collective quiet gasp rippled through the audience. A few prominent investors shook their heads in absolute disgust. My father physically flinched in his chair, shrinking down into his rented tuxedo, desperately hoping no one in the room knew I was talking specifically about him. But when you experience that level of profound betrayal, I continued, shifting my gaze to DeAndre. You are presented with a choice. You can let the grief and the rejection consume you, or you can forge it into an absolute unstoppable weapon. I chose to weaponize it. I chose to pour every ounce of my sorrow into building a financial fortress that nobody could ever tear down. That is the exact foundation of Zuri Holdings. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over the crowd. I took a slow breath, smoothly pivoting the focus of my speech from personal tragedy to the ruthless reality of corporate finance. At Zuri Holdings, we operate on a very simple, uncompromising philosophy. I stated clearly, my voice dropping into a register of cold corporate authority. We demand absolute accountability. In the business world, just like in personal relationships, there is entirely too much tolerance for gross negligence and unchecked arrogance. People believe they can borrow endlessly, spend recklessly, and lie continuously to maintain a fake image of success. I leaned closer to the microphone, locking eyes with DeAndre again. He looked like he was going to vomit. "They believe they are untouchable," I said softly, the acoustics of the room carrying the terrifying threat directly to his ears. "But nobody is untouchable when the bill finally comes due." The crowd nodded in agreement, completely captivated by my absolute conviction. They thought I was delivering a brilliant metaphorical business speech. They had no idea I was actively narrating the real-time destruction of the 4 people sitting in the front row. "That is exactly why our portfolio expansion this quarter has been so incredibly aggressive," I announced, scanning the faces of the bankers who had originally sold me my brother's debt. Just yesterday morning, Zuri Holdings executed a complete ruthless financial acquisition of several highly leveraged, exceptionally toxic assets right here in this city. Calvin's head dropped. He stared at his empty dinner plate, the reality of his total public humiliation crushing his spine. We targeted individuals who prioritize absolute vanity over basic financial responsibility. I continued driving the final nail into their coffin. We acquired the defaulted commercial loans of failing luxury lifestyle brands. We seized the frozen bank accounts of the negligent guarantors who foolishly mortgaged their family homes to fund those delusions. We did not offer grace periods. We did not accept their desperate apologies. We simply bought their debt, foreclosed on their properties, and completely liquidated their fake empires. We removed the toxic waste from the market so that genuine, honest businesses could thrive. The ballroom erupted into a massive round of applause. The investors and corporate leaders loved the aggressive rhetoric. They clapped loudly, cheering for the brilliant executive who was cleaning up the financial sector, entirely oblivious to the fact that the toxic waste I was describing was sitting right at the VIP table. I stood at the podium and watched my family drown in the deafening sound of my success. DeAndre had his hands covering his face. Brenda was weeping silently, her mascara running down her cheeks. Calvin looked like a hollow, empty shell of a man. They were surrounded by hundreds of people clapping for the woman who had just legally rendered them homeless. I would like to dedicate the massive success of this recent acquisition directly to my late husband Jamal and my beautiful daughter Zuri. I concluded, my voice ringing with absolute, unshakable triumph. They taught me what true love looks like, and they gave me the strength to permanently remove the toxic elements from my life. Thank you all for your time, and please enjoy the rest of your evening. I stepped back from the podium as the audience leapt to their feet for a second standing ovation. The applause was absolutely deafening, a roaring wave of validation that washed away the last lingering shadows of my childhood insecurities. I did not smile. I simply offered a polite professional nod to the crowd. I turned sharply on my heel and walked purposefully off the stage, disappearing back through the heavy velvet curtains. As soon as I stepped into the backstage shadows, Malik was waiting for me with a deeply satisfied grin. "Flawless," Malik whispered, handing me a glass of iced water. "You just dismantled them in front of the entire city, and the city actually cheered for it." I took a slow sip of the cold water, feeling the incredible adrenaline pumping steadily through my veins. "Have the security team escort the four of them to my private VIP suite," immediately I ordered, handing the glass back to him. "The public execution is over. Now it is time to read them their sentence." I walked down the quiet, carpeted hallway, leading to the executive VIP suite. The muffled sound of the ballroom completely faded away, replaced by the heavy, soundproofed silence of the private room. Malik walked closely beside me, carrying the thick leather briefcase containing their absolute financial destruction. I opened the heavy mahogany doors and stepped inside. The room was immaculate, furnished with sleek leather couches and a massive modern glass table in the center. I stood on the far side of the table, folded my hands, and waited. 2 minutes later, the doors swung open again. 4 massive event security guards escorted my family into the room. They did not look like the arrogant, untouchable socialites who had marched into the ballroom just an hour earlier. They looked like terrified prisoners being led to the execution block. Brenda was shaking so violently that her heavy silk gown rustled loudly in the quiet room. Keisha had smeared her expensive makeup, wiping her tears, completely ruining her flawless presentation. Calvin walked with a heavy, defeated slouch, his rented tuxedo suddenly looking entirely too big for his shrinking posture. But DeAndre, ever the delusional golden child, desperately tried to salvage his shattered ego. He puffed out his chest aggressively, adjusting his velvet blazer as the security guard stepped back to guard the closed doors. "What kind of sick, twisted joke is this?" Nia DeAndre demanded, his voice cracking slightly, despite his attempt to sound incredibly tough. He pointed a shaking finger at me. You think you can just print a fake magazine cover and humiliate me in front of the entire city? I will sue you for every single penny you have. My lawyers will destroy you for defamation. You have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with. I did not say a single word. I simply looked at him completely unbothered by his pathetic temper tantrum. I reached out and Malik silently handed me the leather briefcase. I placed it onto the heavy glass table, unfastened the brass locks, and reached inside. I pulled out a thick stack of official legal documents. On the very top was the bright yellow notice of default and the immediate foreclosure decrees, stamped with the unmistakable corporate seal of Zuri Holdings. I tossed the heavy stack of paper onto the center of the glass table. The loud, sharp slap of the documents hitting the glass made Brenda physically jump. "Hi, family," I said, my voice cutting through the room like absolute ice. "I am the chief executive officer, and your time is up." DeAndre stared at the documents, his fake bravado instantly evaporating. He recognized the yellow paper. It was the exact same notice he had seen taped to our parents' front door that morning. The realization that I was not bluffing hit him with the force of a freight train. He stumbled backward, his knees giving out slightly, and collapsed onto one of the leather couches. Keisha immediately took 2 large steps away from him, looking at her husband with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. She finally realized that the man she married was not a wealthy entrepreneur, but a completely bankrupt fraud who was entirely at the mercy of the sister he had constantly abused. Calvin stepped forward, his face flushing with a mixture of profound desperation and lingering toxic authority. He placed his hands flat on the glass table, leaning toward me, trying to use the same booming patriarch voice that had terrified me when I was a child. "Nia, you have to stop this right now," Calvin commanded, his voice trembling heavily. "I am your father. You cannot do this to your own blood. We gave you a roof over your head. We raised you. You owe me the respect of a daughter, and I am demanding that you cancel this foreclosure immediately. We are family." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I walked around the glass table and stepped directly into his personal space, forcing him to look me in the eyes. "You lost the right to that title the day you chose a birthday cake over Zura's casket," I replied smoothly, my words dripping with absolute venom. Calvin opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The mention of my dead daughter completely paralyzed him. "You do not get to invoke the word family to save your bank accounts when you could not even be bothered to attend your own granddaughter's funeral." I continued, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of mercy. "You bet your entire legacy on a son who cannot even pay for his own leased cars. And you lost. The foreclosure is absolute. By Thursday morning, the bank will officially seize the colonial house. You have exactly 48 hours to pack whatever fits into your remaining suitcases and vacate my property." Brenda let out a loud, agonizing wail, dropping to her knees on the expensive carpet. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as the reality of her impending homelessness completely shattered her mind. Calvin stared at me, his eyes wide with a terrifying, hollow realization. He was completely broken. There was no more yelling. There were no more threats. He slowly backed away from the table, looking at me not as his scapegoat daughter, but as the ruthless, unstoppable force that had just erased his entire existence. I turned to the security guards standing by the heavy mahogany doors. "Escort them out through the service elevator," I ordered, not sparing my family a single backward glance. They no longer belong in the VIP section. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut, severing my family from the VIP suite and effectively banishing them from the elite world they loved more than me. I stood in the quiet room with Malik, listening to the faint, muffled sounds of the gala continuing outside. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I just felt an overwhelming, profound sense of justice. The dominoes fell with a speed and brutality that was almost breathtaking to witness. The fallout was not just financial. It was a complete, highly public social collapse. Because DeAndre and Keisha no longer had vehicles and were locked out of their rented luxury mansion by the court order, they attempted to check into a five-star hotel downtown later that night. Keisha confidently handed her emergency credit card to the front desk concierge, fully expecting to charge a premium suite. The concierge ran the card and politely informed her it was declined. It was completely maxed out from the designer clothes they had rented for the gala. Keisha tried to argue, her voice echoing loudly through the quiet, opulent hotel lobby. When the concierge firmly told them they had to leave the premises, the absolute reality of DeAndre's bankruptcy finally shattered Keisha's delusions. Right there in the middle of the hotel lobby in front of wealthy guests and security guards, Keisha erupted. She screamed at DeAndre at the top of her lungs, calling him a pathetic fraud and a complete failure. She threw her rented designer clutch at his chest, turned around and walked out into the cold night air, leaving him standing there completely alone. She filed for divorce exactly 3 days later, citing irreconcilable differences and massive financial fraud. Thursday morning arrived with cold, clear skies. Exactly 48 hours after the gala, the sheriff's deputies pulled into the circular driveway of my parents' massive colonial house. They were accompanied by a team of professional movers hired by Zuri Holdings. Calvin and Brenda, the former king and queen of their affluent suburban neighborhood, were forced to carry cheap cardboard boxes out the front door under the watchful eyes of their wealthy neighbors. They had to leave behind the custom furniture, the imported artwork, and the massive crystal chandeliers they had spent 30 years accumulating. I legally seized the property and immediately put it on the market. Simultaneously, Malik finalized the complete liquidation of elite prestige. DeAndre's leased commercial office spaces were emptied. His inventory was sold off at auction for pennies on the dollar. The luxury lifestyle brand he had weaponized against me was completely erased from existence. My parents were forced to downsize to a tiny, cramped two-bedroom apartment on the far industrial outskirts of the city. The apartment building was located right next to a massive, noisy highway. There were no heated swimming pools. There were no manicured lawns. Calvin could no longer afford his expensive golf outings, and Brenda could no longer host her lavish garden parties. They reached out to their wealthy friends for loans and favors, desperately trying to salvage their social standing. But high society is incredibly cruel to people who lose their money. The bank executives, the real estate developers, and the country club members who used to praise them simply stopped returning their phone calls. My parents became total pariahs, completely exiled from the only community they ever cared about. DeAndre's fate was perhaps the most poetic justice of all. With his credit completely destroyed, his business liquidated, and his parents entirely unable to bail him out, he was finally forced to face the real world. He needed cash just to afford basic groceries and pay for a cheap studio apartment. He applied for several corporate management positions, but his background checks revealed massive commercial defaults and zero actual qualifications. He was ultimately forced to take a minimum wage retail job. My golden child brother, the man who used to spray vintage champagne on marble floors, was now a floor associate at a high-end clothing store in the local mall. He spent 40 hours a week folding the exact same designer shirts he used to brag about buying. He had to politely smile and serve the very same wealthy socialites he used to party with. The absolute daily humiliation broke whatever fragile ego he had left. I thought I had seen the last of them. I thought the boundaries I had drawn were permanently secured. But toxic people rarely surrender without one final desperate attempt at manipulation. 2 weeks after the gala, I was sitting in my brand-new high-rise corporate office. I was looking over the final architectural blueprints for a state-of-the-art community youth center I was funding in the city. The intercom on my sleek wooden desk chimed softly. My executive assistant informed me that a woman was causing a scene down in the main lobby. She was crying hysterically, refusing to leave the reception area and claiming it was a family emergency. I knew exactly who it was. I told my assistant to have security escort the woman up to my floor, but to hold her in the reception area outside my glass doors. I stood up, smoothed my tailored blazer, and walked out of my office. Brenda was standing near the elevators, flanked by two large security guards. She looked entirely unrecognizable from the arrogant woman who had demanded I sell my house. She was wearing a cheap faded sweater. Her hair was completely unstyled, and her face was heavily lined with exhaustion and stress. When she saw me walk through the glass doors, she immediately burst into loud theatrical tears. Naya, Brenda wailed, reaching her hands out toward me. "Oh, my baby, please, you have to talk to me. You have to help us." I stopped walking, keeping a solid 10 feet of distance between us. I did not cross my arms. I did not show anger. I just looked at her with the cold, detached observation of a stranger. Brenda took a step forward, her voice trembling with manufactured desperation. "Your father is a broken man, Nia. We are living in a horrible tiny apartment. The heater barely works. DeAndre is absolutely miserable. We have lost everything. Please, I know we made mistakes, but we are your family. You are my daughter. You cannot just leave your own blood out in the cold like this. Family is supposed to forgive each other." She used the word family like a weapon, hoping to strike the old, deeply ingrained childhood guilt that she had spent decades programming into my brain. She thought the sight of her crying would magically erase the memory of her praising DeAndre while I buried my child. She thought blood was a universal currency that could buy her way out of the consequences she rightfully earned. I looked at her tear-stained face, and I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional well was completely dry. I walked slowly over to the receptionist's desk. I did not raise my voice. I did not engage in a screaming match. I simply reached out and pressed the red security button on the console. "Family shows up when it is dark," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, absolute finality that echoed through the marble reception area. "You only showed up when you saw the gold." Brenda froze, her tears instantly stopping as the absolute coldness of my words hit her. "Escort her out," I instructed the two security guards. "And if she or any other member of her family steps foot in this building again, have them arrested for trespassing." The guards immediately stepped forward, taking Brenda by the arms and guiding her toward the descending elevators. She did not fight them. She did not scream. She just stared at me, her eyes wide with the terrifying realization that I was completely permanently gone. The elevator doors slid shut, severing the very last tie to the people who had brought me into this world. I turned around and walked back into my office. I walked past my heavy wooden desk and stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. The city stretched out below me, bathed in the warm golden light of the late afternoon sun. I placed my hand against the cool glass. I was finally at peace. The crushing weight of seeking their approval had been completely lifted from my shoulders. The empire Jamal and I had built was thriving, and the wealth was no longer a secret to be hidden, but a tool to be used for genuine good. I looked down at the documents resting on my desk. They were the final incorporation papers for the Jamal and Zuri Memorial Foundation. I had committed a massive portion of my portfolio to creating an organization dedicated to providing full college scholarships and safe housing for underprivileged families. I was going to use my resources to protect children and support parents who actually loved them. That evening, I did not eat dinner alone. I drove to the quiet suburbs and sat at a warm, crowded table with Jamal's parents and Malik. We passed plates of roasted vegetables and fresh bread. We laughed loudly, sharing stories and making plans for the upcoming holidays. Nobody asked me for money. Nobody insulted my clothing. Nobody told me I was ruining the mood. I looked around the table at the people who had stood by me in the freezing rain, the people who had held an umbrella over my head when the rest of the world walked away. I had survived the absolute worst thing that could ever happen to a mother and a wife. And in the ashes of that devastating fire, I had built a fortress. I realized that true family is never defined by a shared last name or biology. True family is defined by the people who choose to stay when your world falls apart. Sometimes the trash takes itself out, but sometimes you have to buy the garbage truck to get the job done. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace? Tell me your story in the comments. And remember to subscribe. Your worth is not defined by the people who failed to love you.